When people talk about dynasties, they often remember the rise and the collapse, the flashy moments of conquest, and the dramatic scenes of downfall. But most of the time, decline doesn't look like disaster from the inside. It looks like business as usual, with a few cracks that people try to plaster over. That's exactly what was happening in the late Shang dynasty. To their subjects, the Shang still looked powerful. Their bronze foundries clanged day and night, churning out ritual vessels that were both works of art and symbols of authority. Chariots rattled across the land, drawn by horses whose introduction had revolutionized warfare. Kings performed sacrifices, offering up everything from oxen to human captives to maintain favor with their ancestors. The Shang capital at Yin, modern Anyang, bustled with scribes, artisans, and nobles. On the surface, it was a picture of order and majesty. But underneath, the old foundations were rotting. The Shang kings ruled through a heady blend of ritual and raw force. Their legitimacy came from constant communication with the ancestors, literally written into the bones of oxen and turtles. They cracked these oracle bones to divine the will of the spirits, asking questions about war, harvests, and even childbirth. These inscriptions are the earliest written records of Chinese history, and they show a court obsessed with omens. But an obsession with omens isn't always the same thing as an obsession with good governance. By the late 11th century BCE, the Shang had become a dynasty more concerned with ritual correctness and kingly grandeur than with the basic welfare of their subjects. That doesn't mean they were weak, not yet. But the system had become brittle. The man who embodies this twilight more than any other is the last Shang ruler, King Zhou of Shang, also called Dxin. If you read later Zhou accounts, he's portrayed as a tyrant so vile that he makes Nero look like a choir boy. Tales abound of his cruelty, forcing subjects to endure sadistic punishments, inventing the infamous roasting pillar, torture, and indulging in orgies while his people starved. He's said to have built a lake of wine with islands of meat, where he and his concubines would float in drunken revelry. It's a vivid picture, and it certainly makes the Shang's overthrow feel morally justified. But here's the catch. We have to remember that most of these stories come from Zhou sources written after the conquest. Victors, as always, write the history books. So, while Dxin may not have been quite the monster he's painted to be, the fact that he's remembered this way tells us something important. The Zhou needed the Shang to look like villains in order to justify what they were about to do. Still, propaganda aside, there's no denying that the Shang system was running out of steam. The dynasty had lasted for centuries. Its rulers had built a network of vassal states, each tied to the court by bonds of ritual and tribute. But by the 11th century, those vassals weren't so loyal anymore. Many were tired of being squeezed for grain, bronze, and manpower. Some had grievances about succession disputes or heavy-handed demands. Others simply saw opportunities to slip away from Shang authority. These fissures gave the Zhou their opening. The Zhou weren't strangers to the Shang world. They lived in the Wei River Valley, to the west of the Shang heartland. It was fertile country, a place where agriculture thrived, but it also sat at the crossroads between the agrarian culture of the Central Plains and the more rugged life of steppe peoples beyond. The Zhou had to adapt to survive, and in adapting, they became a hybrid people, farmers who raised millet and wheat, but also horse riders who knew the ways of nomads. That duality was their secret weapon. They could operate in the same cultural universe as the Shang, but they also had skills and perspectives the Shang elite never fully grasped. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Zhou is how they carefully played the role of loyal vassals even while building their own power base. For generations, they paid tribute, sent warriors when summoned, and honored the Shang court. But behind that mask of loyalty, they were consolidating alliances. They forged ties with other tribes and vassal states, many of whom had reasons to resent the Shang. They were gathering not just strength, but legitimacy. When the time came, they wouldn't look like mere rebels, they would look like leaders of a coalition. That's a huge difference. You might wonder, why didn't the Shang crush them earlier? After all, it's not like the Zhou were hiding their growing strength. Part of the answer is geography. The Zhou were just far enough on the periphery that they weren't always the top concern of the Shang kings. More importantly, the Shang were overextended. They had to deal with rebellions closer to home, with border raids in the east and south, with the constant pressure of maintaining order in a sprawling, diverse territory. In that sense, the Shang fell victim to the same problem that plagues many empires. They were strong enough to expand, but not nimble enough to manage everything they had absorbed. And here's where timing comes into play. Dynasties don't fall just because someone stronger exists. They fall when weakness and ambition line up. By the late 11th century BCE, the Shang had reached that point. King Zhou's reputation for excess, whether entirely accurate or not, had alienated many allies. His heavy demands for labor and tribute strained relationships. Natural disasters, recorded in oracle bones, may have made things worse. Floods, poor harvests, and eclipses all fueled the sense that heaven itself was withdrawing support. The Zhou, watching from the west, recognized the moment. Now, if we take a step back, there's a bigger theme here. The Zhou were not just preparing to topple a dynasty, they were preparing to redefine what kingship meant. The Shang had built their authority on ancestor worship, rituals, and divination. The Zhou were going to introduce something radically different, the mandate of heaven. But at this early stage, that wasn't yet a formal doctrine, it was just an intuition. They sensed that the Shang had lost their moral claim to rule. And in that sense, the Zhou weren't just planning a coup, they were preparing to frame their coup as a cosmic necessity. Think about that for a moment. Every revolution needs a story. The American colonists had no taxation without representation. The French revolutionaries had liberty, equality, fraternity. The Zhou would have the mandate of heaven. And while they hadn't yet articulated it fully, the seeds were already there. If heaven sent signs through disasters and omens, and if the Shang king kept failing in his duties, then wasn't it obvious that heaven had withdrawn its blessing? And if heaven had withdrawn its blessing, didn't someone else have to step up? That someone else would be the Zhou. The groundwork was laid quietly, through years of preparation. The Zhou chiefs built strongholds in the Wei Valley, organized disciplined warriors, and cultivated an image of just leadership. Stories about King Wen, the wise patriarch of the Zhou clan, painted him as a paragon of virtue, restrained, thoughtful, attuned to the will of heaven. Whether entirely true or not, this reputation mattered. It made the Zhou look like the moral counterpoint to Shang excess. Later, when his son King Wu finally struck against the Shang, this moral contrast would be the heart of the Zhou's claim to power. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, picture a Shang court glittering with bronze and filled with the smoke of sacrifices, but also haunted by unease. Picture vassal lords muttering in private about their grievances. Picture Zhou leaders in the west sharpening their swords, drilling their men, whispering of destiny. The Shang world was still alive, but its heartbeat was slowing. And in that fading rhythm, the Zhou heard opportunity. Every dynasty that manages to overthrow another has, at some point, a visionary. Not always a conqueror in the obvious sense, not always the man swinging the sword on the battlefield, but someone who lays the groundwork. For the Zhou, that man was King Wen, born Ji Chang. His story is part legend, part history, and the way it has been told for centuries says as much about Chinese ideas of leadership as it does about his actual deeds. If the last Shang king, Zhou Xian, was remembered as excess and cruelty personified, then King Wen was remembered as the opposite, a sage leader, careful, moral, almost Confucian before Confucius was even born. Later historians would describe him as the ideal, gentleman ruler, the man who could listen as well as command, who led by example rather than fear. Now, is that portrait a bit too polished? Absolutely. It's hard to imagine that the real Ji Chang was quite so saintly. But the fact that this was the image preserved tells us something crucial. The Zhou victory wasn't just about winning battles, it was about winning the narrative. Let's put some flesh on the bones of his story. Ji Chang was the leader of the Zhou clan in the Wei River Valley, a position that already required a mix of toughness and diplomacy. This was a frontier region rich in farmland, yes, but also vulnerable to raids from nomadic groups and subject to Shang oversight. He had to keep his people fed, keep his warriors sharp, and keep the Shang satisfied that he wasn't a threat. That balancing act is the kind of political high wire that either produces mediocrity or brilliance. Ji Chang turned it into brilliance. One of the first things attributed to him is the ability to forge alliances. He didn't rely solely on brute force to expand Zhou influence. Instead, he married diplomacy with reputation. Neighboring tribes and small states began to see him as a fair dealer, someone whose word could be trusted. That may sound like a small detail, but in a world where trust was fragile and betrayal common, it was revolutionary. People followed the Zhou not only because they were strong, but because King Wen made them feel they were part of something more stable, more honorable. There's also the famous episode of his captivity under the Shang king. According to tradition, Ji Chang's growing influence made Xian uneasy. The Shang king, always suspicious of ambitious vassals, eventually had him imprisoned. Some accounts say he was locked up for 7 years in the Yoli prison. While there, legend claims, he composed parts of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, that ancient text of divination that would become one of China's most enduring classics. Whether he actually wrote the I Ching or not, the symbolism is powerful. Even in captivity, he is portrayed as reflecting on cosmic order, seeking wisdom, thinking not of vengeance, but of harmony. Now, here's where the story takes a human twist. His people couldn't bear to see him rot in prison. So the Zhou chiefs gathered a ransom. And this was no ordinary ransom. It supposedly included beautiful women, prized horses, and even a trained hound called Farais. The Shang king, delighted by such gifts, released Ji Chang. You might imagine him returning bitter, vowing bloody revenge. But the story goes differently. He returned with patience. He didn't raise the flag of rebellion the moment he stepped back into Zhou territory. Instead, he played the long game. And that's what makes King Wen fascinating. He wasn't reckless. He didn't waste his people's lives on a premature revolt. He understood something deeper, that timing is everything. A premature rebellion would fail and confirm Shang authority. A patient build-up, framed as heaven's will, would succeed. That's the seed of the mandate of heaven, not just a philosophical idea, but a political strategy. Under his leadership, the Zhou continued to expand their influence westward, absorbing smaller tribes and strengthening their base. Each conquest wasn't just military, it was cultural. He integrated local leaders, respected their customs, and bound them to the Zhou through kinship ties. If you think of it in modern terms, it was like building a coalition government instead of annexing territory outright. People weren't just conquered, they were invited to become part of something bigger. But make no mistake, there was steel beneath the silk. King Wen wasn't naive. He trained his warriors, fortified his cities, and kept an eye on Shang weaknesses. Every report of Shang brutality or overreach was noted. Every discontented vassal was a potential ally. He was like a chess player, watching his opponent grow overconfident while quietly setting up the board for checkmate. And let's talk for a moment about the role of morality in politics. To us today, morality in politics often sounds like a contradiction. But in early Chinese thought, morality and legitimacy were inseparable. A ruler who governed unjustly didn't just fail politically, he lost heaven's favor. King Wen embodied this belief. His governance was remembered as virtuous, measured, and just. People weren't just loyal to him because he was strong, they were loyal because they believed he was good. Whether or not this reputation was carefully cultivated propaganda, it worked. When the Zhou eventually challenged the Shang, they could say with confidence, "Look at our king. Look at yours. Who seems favored by heaven?" One analogy might help here. Think of the Shang as a corporation that had grown bloated and arrogant, run by a CEO who spent more time on yachts than in the office. Meanwhile, the Zhou were like a scrappy startup with a charismatic founder who treated his employees like family, listened to feedback, and built a reputation for fairness. When the economy shifted and the big corporation faltered, who would people trust to lead? The startup. King Wen was that founder. Now, of course, he never got to see the final showdown. Fate can be cruel that way. King Wen died before the Zhou launched their decisive war against the Shang. That task fell to his son, King Wu. But here's the thing, by the time he died, he had already planted the seeds so deeply that they were impossible to uproot. His alliances, his moral reputation, his patient cultivation of strength, these were the roots of Zhou's success. Without him, King Wu might have been just another ambitious warlord. With him, the Zhou had the legitimacy of a movement. One last detail worth noting, the way later texts describe King Wen's relationship with heaven. They say he could sense heaven's will in natural signs, that he governed in harmony with cosmic order. It sounds almost mystical, but politically, it was genius. By aligning his rule with the cosmos, he turned political rebellion into moral necessity. He didn't just prepare to topple a king, he prepared to change the very definition of kingship. So picture him now, not a conqueror with blood on his hands, but a statesman, sitting in his Zhou stronghold, hearing reports from scouts, sending envoys to discontented vassals, watching the Shang king squander his legitimacy. Patient, thoughtful, quietly confident. He wasn't the one who swung the sword at the final battle, but without him, there would have been no sword to swing. There's a rhythm in history. One generation plants, the next harvests. King Wen spent his life sowing seeds, alliances, legitimacy, patience, and when he died, the Zhou were strong, but the Shang still sat on the throne. It was up to his son, King Wu, GFA, to step forward and finish what his father had started. And you can imagine the weight he carried. Every Zhou warrior, every allied vassal, every family tied into this fragile coalition must have looked to him and thought, will you act? Will you risk everything? The way the story is told, King Wu was very different from his father in temperament. Where Wen was cautious, Wu was bold. He had the restless energy of someone who knew that patience had already been spent. And history seemed to be offering him an opening. The Shang were weaker than ever. King Zhou Xian was alienating allies at an alarming pace. Omens, eclipses, strange natural disasters were interpreted as heaven's dissatisfaction. The time had come. But let's pause here because King Wu didn't rush headlong into rebellion. That's the fascinating part. He inherited his father's caution even as he leaned toward action. The Zhou had been preparing for decades, but even then, an outright challenge to the Shang throne was risky. One wrong move, one lost battle, and the Zhou would be crushed like countless rebels before them. So King Wu gathered his allies carefully. He summoned lords from across the region who were disillusioned with Shang rule. Some came out of loyalty, some out of opportunism, and some out of sheer hatred for Zhou Xian. Together, they formed a coalition, something more like a confederation of the disgruntled than a single unified army. But under Wu's banner, it looked like a movement blessed by destiny. And destiny was the key. This is the moment when the mandate of heaven crystallized into political doctrine. The Zhou didn't just say, we're stronger than the Shang. They said, heaven has withdrawn its favor from the Shang, and we are heaven's chosen replacement. That idea was electric. It wasn't rebellion anymore, it was restoration. It wasn't ambition, it was necessity. And the brilliance of the mandate of heaven was that it explained everything people were already seeing. If floods came, it was because the Shang king had lost heaven's favor. If harvests failed, it was because the dynasty was corrupt. If allies flocked to King Wu, it was because heaven had decreed it. Every sign pointed toward Zhou legitimacy. Here's an analogy that might help. Think of a failing company. Employees grumble, managers leave, profits dip. Then a new CEO candidate steps in and says, look, it's not just bad luck. The board has lost confidence in this leadership. I'm here because the company needs a new direction. That's exactly how the mandate of heaven worked, but on a cosmic scale. Heaven itself, not just the people, was the board withdrawing its support. King Wu was savvy enough to couch his rebellion in moral, not personal, terms. He wasn't just seizing power, he was rescuing the realm from tyranny. Later texts describe him standing before his coalition, delivering this speech at Mai. He declared that King Zhou of Shang was guilty of cruelty, of alienating the people, of turning away from heaven. His words weren't just propaganda, they were liturgy, a ritual of justification. Imagine the effect on his audience. Weary vassals, bitter at Shang taxes and arrogance, suddenly told that their discontent wasn't just political, it was sacred. They weren't traitors, they were heaven's instruments. What followed would become one of the most famous clashes in Chinese antiquity, the Battle of Mai. But before we get there, that's for the next section, it's worth emphasizing how radical the mandate of heaven really was. The Shang had claimed divine ancestry, their kings directly tied to the spirits. The Zhou reframed it entirely. They argued that heaven wasn't a personal family blessing, it was a moral contract. A dynasty could hold it as long as it governed well, but if it failed, if it became corrupt, cruel, or inept, then heaven would take it away. And here's the kicker. Once heaven withdrew the mandate, rebellion wasn't rebellion anymore. It was duty. That idea would echo across Chinese history for millennia. Every dynasty that followed the Zhou would claim the mandate of heaven for itself. Every rebellion would justify itself by declaring that the ruling house had lost it. Floods, earthquakes, plagues, these weren't random disasters. They were heaven's verdict. The Zhou didn't just win a war, they invented a political philosophy that became the backbone of Chinese legitimacy. And King Wu was the man who turned that philosophy into action. Now, from a more human perspective, imagine the atmosphere in the Zhou camp as these ideas spread. Warriors sharpening bronze swords, charioteers preparing their horses, lords whispering about omens and prophecies. There must have been a sense that they weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting in a cosmic drama. That kind of conviction can make men fearless. It can also make them ruthless. Once you believe heaven is on your side, compromise starts to look like betrayal. King Wu embodied that conviction. But he also embodied something subtler: timing. He didn't strike the moment he took power. He waited, tested, rallied. When he finally marched eastward, it wasn't as a rebel sneaking into Shang territory, it was as a king claiming what heaven had already promised. That distinction, more than anything, explains why the Zhou succeeded where so many others had failed. So, when we think of King Wu, we shouldn't picture just a warrior king, though he certainly was one. We should picture a man standing at the hinge of history, holding in his hand not just a sword, but an idea, a new definition of kingship, one that would outlast him by centuries. The mandate of heaven wasn't fully written down yet, wasn't yet codified in philosophy, but in practice, in the speeches he gave and the banners he raised, it was already real. And once an idea becomes real, it can't be stuffed back into the bottle. As King Wu prepared his coalition for war, the Shang were still sitting in their capital, confident in their rituals, deaf to the growing chorus of discontent. The Zhou's time had come, and everyone could feel it. The rebellion wasn't just rebellion anymore. It was heaven's verdict waiting to be delivered. Some battles in history are remembered because of their size, hundreds of thousands clashing across wide plains. Others are remembered because of their consequences. The Battle of Mai, fought around 1046 BCE, falls firmly into the second category. It was not the largest battle the world has ever seen. It may not even have lasted very long. But in its outcome, an entire dynasty fell, another rose, and a political philosophy was stamped into the DNA of China for the next 3 millennia. Picture the scene. King Wu of Zhou has finally gathered his coalition, tribes and vassals weary of Shang excess, warriors loyal to the Zhou cause, men convinced that heaven itself had decreed their struggle. Ancient accounts speak of 45,000 Zhou troops marching eastward, though the numbers are debated. Against them, the Shang king Zhou Xian mustered what was said to be a massive force of 700,000. Even if those numbers are inflated, the contrast is striking. On paper, the Shang were overwhelming. But numbers in war don't always tell the whole story. Morale, loyalty, and legitimacy can weigh heavier than sheer manpower. As the Zhou army advanced, the symbolism was thick in the air. King Wu carried the white banners of heaven, invoking divine favor. His speeches reminded the troops that they weren't fighting merely for land, they were fighting because the Shang had betrayed their sacred trust. Imagine being a foot soldier in that army, clutching a bronze dagger axe, looking at your comrades, and hearing your king declare that heaven itself marched beside you. Fear must have mixed with exhilaration. On the Shang side, things looked far less certain. King Zhou Xian had gathered a massive host, yes, but many of his men were conscripts, pressed into service from vassals already bitter at his rule. Loyalty was shaky. Confidence was thin. Later records claim that some Shang troops even defected mid-battle to join the Zhou. Whether or not that happened exactly as described, the fact that it was remembered this way tells us how fragile the Shang coalition had become. An army is only as strong as its faith in the cause, and the Shang cause was crumbling. The battlefield itself, lay near the Shang capital of Yin, modern Anyang. For the Zhou, it was the doorstep of destiny. For the Shang, it was the last desperate defense of a dynasty centuries old. The clash began with chariots, the prestige weapon of the age, thundering across the plain. Shang chariots, with their well-trained horses and crews of 3, driver, archer, warrior, had long been symbols of military supremacy. But the Zhou had adapted the same technology. They knew how to counter it. Bronze weapons glinted in the sun, drums and horns roared to keep formations moving in unison. And then came the turn. According to the Book of Documents, Shujing, the Shang army faltered almost immediately. Some soldiers laid down their weapons. Others turned on their own side. The Zhou advanced steadily, their coalition holding firm, while the Shang forces dissolved into chaos. What should have been a crushing defense by the numerically superior Shang became a rout. Within hours, the dynasty that had ruled China for centuries collapsed like a house of cards. King Zhou Xine of Shang, seeing the disaster, fled back to his palace. The stories about his end are as dramatic as his life. One account says he retreated into his treasure-filled palace, lit it on fire, and burned alive, unwilling to face capture. Others claim he took his own life in shame. The image of the last Shang king, surrounded by wealth but consumed by flames, became a powerful metaphor for the dynasty's fate, consumed by its own excess. Now, let's not take every detail literally. Ancient chroniclers loved moral lessons, and the Zhou had every reason to paint the Shang's downfall as theatrical and just. But the broader truth is clear. The Shang's strength was hollow, their army unwilling to fight for a king they despised. The Zhou, smaller in number but united in purpose, swept them aside. Think for a moment about the psychology of that battlefield. For the Zhou, it was the culmination of decades of patience, of King Wen's careful preparation, of King Wu's bold gamble. Every warrior must have felt that history's tide was lifting them. For the Shang, it was disillusionment laid bare. Imagine standing in a massive army, told you are the mightiest force in the land, only to look around and see comrades deserting, officers unsure, your king's authority vanishing before your eyes. Armies can disintegrate faster than they form, and Mai was proof of that. The aftermath was swift. With the Shang capital fallen, the Zhou marched in not as raiders but as rulers. King Wu performed sacrifices to heaven, solidifying his claim to the mandate. He spared many Shang nobles, incorporating them into the new Zhou order rather than exterminating them. That was a shrewd move. It turned enemies into subjects and gave the Zhou a veneer of continuity rather than pure rupture. This wasn't chaos, it was heaven's smooth transition, or so the Zhou presented it. And this is where the brilliance of their messaging comes in again. The Zhou didn't just say, "We won." They said, "The Shang lost the mandate, and heaven passed it to us." The battle wasn't framed as conquest, but as correction. People don't like feeling they live in a world of raw power. They want to believe in justice, in cosmic order. The mandate of heaven gave them that belief. It was political genius, wrapped in religious language. Looking back, the Battle of Mai almost feels inevitable, but it wasn't. If the Shang army had stood firm, if Zhou allies had wavered, if omens had seemed less favorable, the Zhou might have been crushed. History is full of near misses. But when things align, timing, morale, leadership, what looks like a gamble becomes destiny fulfilled. For King Wu, the victory was both an end and a beginning, the end of Shang dominance and the beginning of Zhou rule. And here's the irony worth savoring. The Shang had pioneered so many of the cultural forms the Zhou would inherit: bronze casting, oracle bone writing, ancestral rituals. The Zhou toppled them not by rejecting their world, but by mastering it and reframing its meaning. The tools of legitimacy remained the same. The story was rewritten. That's why Mai matters. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a page-turning moment, where the script of Chinese history was literally rewritten in blood, fire, and bronze. So, in the smoke of Mai, As the Shang capital smoldered and Zhou banners rose, a new dynasty took its place on the throne of China. And not just any dynasty, but one that would last longer than almost any other in world history, shaping the very vocabulary of legitimacy for centuries. The Shang had ruled by ritual and ancestry, the Zhou would rule by heaven's mandate. And the world would never be quite the same. Winning a battle is one thing. Winning a country is another. After the fires of Mai died down and King Zhou of Shang was no more than a grim cautionary tale, King Wu and the Zhou faced the hardest challenge of all: how to turn a fragile coalition into a dynasty. Armies can scatter the moment victory is won, allies can drift back into old rivalries, resentment can simmer when spoils are divided. The Zhou needed to do more than just sit on the Shang throne. They needed to make their rule feel legitimate, natural, even inevitable. One of their first moves was symbolic but profound. They kept much of the Shang ritual order intact. The Zhou didn't sweep in and say, "Forget your ancestors, forget your traditions, we'll show you a new way." Instead, they said, "We honor what came before, but heaven has shifted its mandate." That continuity mattered. It reassured those who had lived under Shang rule that life wouldn't become unrecognizable overnight. Temples were still active, bronzes were still cast, sacrifices still performed, but now the Zhou king stood at the center of it all. But the Zhou also added something new. The language of the mandate of heaven was woven into everything. If Shang rituals had emphasized lineage and connection to specific ancestors, Zhou rituals emphasized cosmic approval and moral responsibility. That subtle shift made all the difference. It was no longer enough to be the son of the right king. You had to be virtuous, or at least appear so, to keep heaven's favor. In practice, this gave the Zhou both legitimacy and flexibility. If challenged, they could always point to their victory at Mai, their moral superiority, and any convenient natural sign as proof of heaven's blessing. The consolidation of power also meant dealing with the remnants of Shang nobility. And here, King Wu and his advisors showed remarkable pragmatism. Instead of wiping them out, they incorporated them into the new order. Some Shang elites were allowed to keep their fiefs under Zhou oversight. One branch of the royal Shang family was even enfeoffed in a small state called Song, where they continued to perform Shang rituals in a diminished but respectable role. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. By preserving a line of Shang ritual authority, the Zhou could claim they hadn't destroyed the old order, they had absorbed it. That made their takeover look less like a rupture and more like a heavenly succession. It also helped avoid rebellion. People who had served the Shang for generations didn't have to see themselves as traitors now. They could keep their customs, honor their old kings, and still acknowledge Zhou's supremacy. It was a balancing act, but it worked. Imagine if the Americans, after defeating the British in the Revolution, had allowed George III's relatives to keep some symbolic role in the new United States. It sounds absurd, but it would have softened the blow. The Zhou understood the value of symbolic continuity. Of course, they also knew when to use force. Some regions resisted, refusing to bow to Zhou authority. King Wu led campaigns to crush these holdouts. The Zhou army, fresh from its victory, was eager and disciplined. These campaigns weren't just military mop-ups, they were demonstrations. Each defeated rebellion proved that heaven remained on Zhou's side. Each victory reminded the people that resistance was futile. Within a few years, the Zhou had stamped out serious opposition and stretched their authority across the Central Plains. Now, here's a fascinating twist. King Wu didn't live long after his victory. Tradition says he died only a few years after Mai, leaving his son, King Cheng, still a child. In many cultures, the death of a conquering king so soon after victory would have spelled disaster. But the Zhou had something extraordinary: the leadership of the Duke of Zhou, King Wu's brother. The Duke of Zhou stepped in as regent for the young king, and his reputation became legendary. Later generations, especially Confucius, revered him as the model of loyalty and selflessness. He could have seized the throne for himself. He had the power, the army, and the position. Instead, he ruled in the name of his nephew, stabilized the dynasty, and expanded its reach. Imagine how rare that is in history, a powerful regent who doesn't take the crown but protects it. It's no wonder Chinese thinkers remembered him as a paragon of virtue. During his regency, the Duke of Zhou did more than just keep order. He laid the institutional foundations of Zhou rule. He helped codify the idea of the mandate of heaven, not just as propaganda but as political philosophy. He oversaw the spread of Zhou authority into newly conquered lands, establishing a system of feudal enfeoffments where relatives and loyal allies were granted fiefs. These lords would rule locally but owe loyalty and tribute to the Zhou king. It was a clever way to extend control without overextending the central government. The Zhou didn't have the bureaucracy to govern everything directly, but through this network of kinship and fealty, they could maintain influence across vast territories. Think of it like franchising a brand. The Zhou king was the parent company, the enfeoffed lords were franchise owners. They ran their own local operations, but they still carried the Zhou name, performed Zhou rituals, and acknowledged Zhou supremacy. As long as they didn't stray too far, the system worked. The Duke of Zhou also built a new capital, Chengzhou, near modern Luoyang, which functioned as a symbolic center of Zhou authority. By placing it closer to the eastern lands once controlled by the Shang, he made a statement. The Zhou weren't just Western upstarts, they were now the rulers of all under heaven. This dual capital arrangement, with the original Zhou homeland in the west and the new center in the east, reflected their effort to straddle tradition and innovation, homeland and empire. What's striking about this early consolidation phase is how it combined ruthlessness with idealism. On one hand, the Zhou crushed dissent with military might, installed their relatives as feudal lords, and demanded tribute. On the other hand, they couched everything in moral language: heaven's will, virtuous rule, loyalty, harmony. That combination proved powerful. People will endure harsh rule if they believe it's righteous, and they will accept new rulers if those rulers make them feel part of a moral order. And let's not forget the cultural side. Early Zhou consolidation wasn't just political, it was cultural engineering. Rituals were standardized, hierarchies reinforced, and the great bronze vessels of the era carried inscriptions celebrating Zhou virtue and heaven's blessing. These weren't just artworks, they were billboards in bronze, messages cast for eternity. The Zhou rule because heaven has chosen them. Looking back, it's easy to think the Zhou's success was guaranteed. But it wasn't. Imagine how precarious things must have felt in those first years. A boy king on the throne, rebellious states testing the new dynasty, the memory of Shang power still fresh. The fact that the Zhou not only survived but thrived was the result of careful strategy, moral messaging, and the steady hand of the Duke of Zhou. Without him, the Zhou might have gone down as just another failed rebellion. With him, they became the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history. So when we talk about early Zhou consolidation, we're really talking about the art of turning victory into legitimacy. They didn't just win battles, they won hearts, minds, and the narrative of history. And in doing so, they ensured that the Zhou would not be a flash in the pan but a dynasty that defined an age. A dynasty can't rule on charisma alone. King Wu's victory at Mai, the Duke of Zhou's regency, and the boy King Cheng's symbolic authority had given the Zhou momentum, but momentum fades unless it's turned into structure. The Zhou understood that perfectly. They didn't just need to hold the throne, they needed to weave a fabric of power strong enough to cover vast territories and flexible enough to last. The solution they created was what historians call the Zhou feudal order, a system so distinctive that echoes of it would be felt long after the dynasty itself crumbled. Now, if you hear feudalism, you might picture medieval Europe. Armored knights swearing loyalty to lords, castles dotting the landscape, peasants tied to the land. The Zhou system was different, though it shares the same DNA of decentralization. It was less about knights and castles, more about kinship, ritual, and obligation. The Zhou were smart enough to know that they couldn't directly govern every inch of land they had just acquired. Their bureaucracy was rudimentary, their communication slow, their resources stretched. So instead of pretending they could control everything, they leaned into the strength they did have: family ties and personal loyalty. Here's how it worked. After conquering the Shang, the Zhou kings parceled out land to their relatives and most trusted allies. These parcels weren't tiny estates, they were entire regions, often with their own capitals, armies, and administrations. Each recipient became a feudal lord or zhou, responsible for ruling his territory, maintaining order, and providing military support when the Zhou king called. In return, these lords recognized the Zhou king as the son of heaven, performed rituals in his name, and paid tribute. Think of it as a pyramid. At the top sat the Zhou king, holding the mandate of heaven. Below him were the great lords, most of them kin, who held fiefs across the land. Beneath them were minor lords and clan leaders, each owing loyalty upward. At the base were the farmers, artisans, and common folk, whose labor kept the whole thing afloat. On paper, it was elegant. By tying power to family bonds, the Zhou created a sense of trust and stability. You weren't just ruling as a bureaucrat in some distant office. You were ruling as a brother, cousin, or in-law of the king. Loyalty was literally in your blood. Ritual reinforced this kinship. When the Zhou court held great ceremonies, these lords came together, feasted, sacrificed, and renewed their bonds under heaven's gaze. Politics was family, and family was sacred. And it worked for a while. In those first centuries, the Zhou order created a remarkably stable balance. Local lords had enough autonomy to manage their lands effectively, but they also had a stake in the dynasty's survival. The king didn't have to micromanage everything. Instead, he was the ritual and moral center, the keystone in an arch of kinship that held the whole structure together. But let's not romanticize it too much. The system had hard edges. Peasants were bound to their land, paying taxes in grain and labor to their local lord. Armies could be raised quickly, but they were often patchwork coalitions of different fiefs, not a single standing force. Power was diffuse, and while that reduced the risk of overextension, it also planted the seeds of future fragmentation. You can almost hear the contradiction baked into it. The very autonomy that made the system workable in the short term would, centuries later, make it fragile. One of the most fascinating parts of the Zhou feudal order was the way it merged politics with ritual. The Zhou didn't just parcel out land, they parceled out responsibility for ancestral worship, for the performance of ceremonies that connected heaven and earth. Each feudal lord became not only a political ruler, but a ritual leader, reinforcing the Zhou claim that their whole system reflected cosmic harmony. When lords sacrificed to their ancestors, when they observed seasonal rites, when they upheld Zhou ritual codes, they were weaving themselves into a single sacred fabric. Rebellion wasn't just political treachery, it was sacrilege. The Duke of Zhou deserves credit here too. During his regency, he codified the rights and responsibilities of these feudal lords, ensuring that the system had a backbone. He emphasized the king's role as the son of heaven, not just another warlord. He made sure that loyalty to the Zhou crown was not only expected but sanctified. Later Chinese thinkers would look back on this system as the model of a well-ordered world where everyone knew their place and performed their duty. But, of course, reality was messier. Feudal lords weren't always loyal. Ambition didn't vanish just because someone married into the Zhou clan. And as generations passed, blood ties grew thinner, loyalties more tenuous. Already in the early centuries, some lords tested the limits of their autonomy. Still, in its heyday, the system held. It allowed the Zhou to govern a realm far larger than their direct resources could manage. If you want a modern analogy, think of it like a startup that grows too fast. The founders can't personally run every office, so they franchise to trusted family members and close friends. Each new branch has independence, but still carries the brand. For a time, it works brilliantly. The company expands faster than anyone thought possible. But eventually, quality control slips and some branches start doing their own thing. That was the Zhou feudal order in a nutshell. What made it last as long as it did was the powerful glue of ritual culture. Bronze inscriptions from the period celebrate loyalty to the king, commemorate gifts of land, and remind future generations that their power came from heaven through the Zhou throne. These weren't just decorative, they were political contracts cast in metal. A lord receiving a bronze vessel inscribed with royal favor wasn't just getting a pretty object. He was receiving a visible, enduring symbol of his place in the cosmic order. There's a phrase Chinese historians often use to describe this system, fengjian, the enfeoffment system. It literally means granting fiefs. But it carried layers of meaning, obligation, reciprocity, ritual, morality. It wasn't a cold contract, it was a living web of duties. And that's why it lasted centuries longer than it probably should have. People didn't see it as arbitrary politics, they saw it as the natural order of the world. And yet, because there's always a yet in history, this system contained the seeds of its own undoing. By decentralizing so much power, the Zhou created lords who could, and eventually would, act as kings in their own right. For now, though, in the early years, the system worked like a charm. The Zhou transformed a fragile victory into a dynasty not by building a massive bureaucracy, but by building a family ritual order that stretched across the land. In the glow of their early reign, it must have felt like a golden age was dawning. The Zhou kings were strong, their lords loyal, their rituals resonant. Heaven's mandates seemed secure. And yet, as always, the cracks were already there, waiting for time to pry them open. Every dynasty has a moment when it seems unshakable, when the world feels orderly, the people content, and the heavens aligned. For the Zhou, that moment is what historians call the Western Zhou Golden Age, roughly from the reign of King Qing through King Kong and into King Zhao and King Mu. This was the first phase of their long rule, when the dynasty's heart was still anchored in the Wei River Valley and their feudal system hummed with energy and loyalty. It was the age when the Zhou were not merely rulers, but architects of a world order, confident enough to think they had discovered the formula for everlasting harmony. To understand why this felt like a golden age, you need to imagine the mood of the time. After centuries under the Shang, with its rigid ancestor worship and increasingly despotic last kings, the Zhou appeared fresh, moral, and almost utopian. The mandate of heaven was still new, and it carried a sense of possibility. The people could believe that their rulers had not simply inherited power but had earned it. That belief, more than any army, held the dynasty together in these early centuries. The kings of this era, King Qing, the boy king who had the Duke of Zhou as regent, his son King Kong, and their successors, were remembered as models of virtue. Later records praise their governance as balanced, measured, and prosperous. King Qing, though young when he inherited the throne, had the Duke of Zhou's guiding hand, ensuring that the dynasty's institutions were firmly laid. King Kang then presided over a period of remarkable peace and stability. There's even a phrase from later texts, under King Qing and King Kong, the realm was at peace, all under heaven was well governed. It's the kind of phrase dynasties love to use to describe themselves, but for once, it might have been true. What did this golden age look like on the ground? Fields tilled in orderly rows, harvests brought in under ritual calendars, bronze vessels cast not just for war but to commemorate acts of virtue. Local lords, still bound by close kinship to the royal house, paid tribute faithfully and joined in great court rituals. Roads and communication lines, crude by later standards, still managed to knit together far-flung fiefs. Armies, though decentralized, answered the king's summons when called. The Zhou capital of Haojing near modern Xi'an became a vibrant political and ritual center where envoys and lords gathered to renew their bonds to the Son of Heaven. The ritual system of the Zhou flowered during this time. The Duke of Zhou's reforms standardized ceremonies that reinforced hierarchy and cosmic harmony. Seasonal rites aligned human activity with the cycles of heaven and earth. Music, dance, and feasting weren't just entertainment, they were instruments of order. Every gesture, every note, every sacrificial offering reminded participants of their place in the grand scheme. Imagine a lord standing in the Zhou court, watching the king perform sacrifices to heaven, and feeling in his bones that this was not just politics, but sacred duty. That sense of cosmic choreography made the system feel timeless. Bronze inscriptions from this era give us glimpses of the confidence of the time. They record the granting of land, the rewarding of service, the celebration of loyalty. Each inscription was like a snapshot of Zhou ideology. The king bestows, the vassal serves, heaven smiles. These weren't dusty formalities, they were affirmations of a shared worldview. If you were a feudal lord receiving such a vessel, It wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder that your power flowed through Zhou legitimacy, that you were woven into heaven's plan. Economically, too, the Western Zhou flourished. Agriculture remained the backbone, and the fertile soils of the Wei Valley gave abundant harvests. The Zhou also expanded their reach, bringing new territories under cultivation, spreading their system eastward into lands that had once been Shang. Tribute flowed into the capital: grain, livestock, bronze, jade. This wealth wasn't hoarded alone. It fueled the ritual splendor of the dynasty, which in turn reinforced its legitimacy. It was a feedback loop. Prosperity fed ritual, ritual fed legitimacy, legitimacy fed stability, stability fed prosperity. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Border conflicts flared with non-Zhou peoples, especially in the south and west. The Zhou launched campaigns to pacify or incorporate these groups. Yet, even war in this period was framed as moral duty, not mere expansion. Victories were celebrated as heaven's approval, defeats were rationalized as temporary trials. For the Zhou elite, history itself seemed to confirm their worldview. One of the most remarkable aspects of this golden age was the sheer confidence of the Zhou kings. King Mu, for instance, is remembered not only for governance, but for legend. Later tales say he traveled with an enormous retinue across the western deserts, seeking the Queen Mother of the West, a goddess of immortality. Whether he actually did or not, the story reveals how Zhou kings saw themselves, not just rulers of men, but figures at the hinge between the human and cosmic realms. That blending of myth and governance gave their rule an aura beyond mere politics. And here's the thing: stability breeds optimism. During this period, Chinese culture began to develop with a sense of permanence. The Zhou weren't just managing power, they were shaping identity. They set patterns of governance, ritual, and morality that would echo for centuries. When Confucius, 500 years later, looked for models of good governance, he pointed back here to the early Zhou kings, the Duke of Zhou, and the golden age of Western Zhou. That tells you just how deeply this period lodged in cultural memory. But golden ages, if we're honest, are often golden because they're short. They shine brightly, then dim as the structures that hold them up begin to creak. Already in the late Western Zhou, strains were appearing. Lords farther from the royal center began acting more independently. Ambitious kings pushed risky campaigns that strained resources. The bond of kinship that had seemed unbreakable began to fray with time. The very decentralization that made the system workable began to show its cracks. Still, for those living in the heartland under Kings Cheng, Kang, and their successors, it must have felt like history had found its rhythm. The Zhou feudal order was functioning, the mandate of heaven secure, prosperity abundant, rituals harmonious. It was a world where the Son of Heaven sat at the center, lords bowed willingly, and the cosmos seemed aligned. The golden age of the Western Zhou was never just about wealth or power. It was about belief, the belief that human society could mirror cosmic order, that politics could be morality, that heaven would reward virtue with stability. That belief would carry the Zhou for centuries, even as reality grew more complicated. For now, though, the dynasty basked in its brightest light, convinced that it had solved the riddle of ruling forever. If the Western Zhou Golden Age had a soundtrack, it wasn't just the clang of weapons or the bustle of markets. It was the solemn rhythm of drums, the rise of ritual chants, the shimmer of bronze bells in ceremonial halls. Ritual wasn't just a side note to Zhou politics, it was the very stage on which authority was performed and reinforced. And nothing embodied that stage better than the dazzling world of bronze vessels. Let's start with the mindset. For the Zhou elite, the universe wasn't random. Heaven, earth, and humanity were all bound together in a web of order. Rulers didn't just command armies, they mediated between cosmic forces and the human realm. That mediation had to be made visible, tangible, repeated. And so ritual was everywhere: seasonal sacrifices, ancestral rites, feasts of loyalty, coronations, funerals. Each event reminded participants that the Zhou king was no ordinary man. He was the Son of Heaven, the pivot between the divine and the earthly. And what do you need to perform a ritual properly? Objects. Not just any objects, but heavy, enduring, awe-inspiring bronzes, cauldrons, ding, wine vessels, ju, gu, zun, water basins, bells, drums. These weren't kitchenware, they were sacred technology. Each vessel carried meaning. The three-legged cauldron wasn't just for cooking meat, it was a symbol of stability and authority, its tripod form echoing cosmic balance. A wine vessel wasn't just for drinking, it was a channel between ancestors and descendants, heaven and earth. The Zhou mastered the art of making these vessels not only functional, but spectacular. Cast in elaborate molds, decorated with fearsome Tao-Dai masks, stylized animal faces whose staring eyes seemed to watch from another world, the bronzes radiated power. To lift one was to feel the weight of authority. To pour libations from one was to participate in a cosmic drama. But here's where the Zhou added a brilliant twist: inscriptions. Unlike the Shang, who left most oracle bones and bronzes anonymous, the Zhou used bronze vessels as monuments. Lords who received gifts of land or titles from the king often cast bronzes inscribed with the event. A typical inscription might say, "The king commanded X to guard such and such territory. X dares to record this in metal for 10,000 years." These inscriptions were political contracts in bronze. They celebrated loyalty, enshrined royal authority, and immortalized the bond between ruler and subject. Think about the impact. Stone inscriptions can weather away. Oral traditions fade. But a bronze vessel, buried in a tomb, could last millennia. Every time a lord's descendants pulled out that vessel for ancestral rites, they read the inscription, recited the story, and remembered that their power came from Zhou favor. It was propaganda cast in metal, durable as belief itself. And the bronzes weren't just for show in tombs. They were used in living rituals. Imagine the Zhou king presiding over a great ceremony at Haojing. Vassals gathered from across the realm. Rows of bronzes stood filled with sacrificial wine, steaming meat, fragrant grains. Musicians struck bells and drums, dancers moved in stately steps, priests chanted invocations. The king lifted a cauldron lid or poured from a vessel, and the act itself was legitimacy in motion. Everyone watching understood this wasn't just a feast. It was proof that heaven smiled on the Zhou, that order prevailed, that the king was what he claimed to be. Later philosophers like Confucius would look back on these rituals with nostalgia, praising them as models of harmony. He wasn't interested in the meat or the wine. He was interested in the discipline, the symbolism, the way ritual bound society together. For him, ritual, li, was an empty tradition, it was the fabric of civilization. And the Zhou had been the weavers. But let's not forget the human side. Ritual could inspire awe, yes, but it could also intimidate. To stand in front of gleaming rows of bronze vessels, each larger than a man's torso, was to feel small. To be reminded that your place in the cosmic order was beneath the sun of heaven. Ritual wasn't just piety, it was performance of hierarchy. When you bowed at court, you weren't just honoring the king, you were reaffirming the whole architecture of Zhou power. Of course, like any system of symbolism, it could also become rigid. The Zhou elite became obsessed with proper ritual performance, to the point where debates about how many cauldrons a lord was allowed, or what music should be played in which season, could spark controversy. There's a famous principle: 9 ding cauldrons belong to the Son of Heaven. That wasn't a cooking instruction, it was a declaration that only the Zhou king could hold the full set of cosmic authority. If a lord dared to cast too many, it was tantamount to rebellion. What's striking is how material culture and politics fused so seamlessly. In the West, we often separate art from politics. In the Zhou world, art was politics. A bronze vessel wasn't just beautiful, it was an argument cast in metal. A ritual wasn't just pious, it was the machinery of legitimacy. And because these things were so tangible, so visible, they could bind a decentralized empire together in ways decrees alone never could. Archaeology today confirms the sheer scale of this ritual culture. Tombs from the Western Zhou are filled with bronzes, often inscribed with long records of loyalty and service. One vessel might recount a king rewarding a general after a victorious campaign. Another might celebrate the granting of land to a loyal lord. Each is a puzzle piece in the vast propaganda campaign that was Zhou rule. Together, they paint a picture of a dynasty obsessed with embedding its authority into daily, visible, durable form. Now, was everyone convinced? Not always. Rituals can alienate as much as they inspire. For peasants struggling in the fields, the grandeur of bronze vessels might have seemed distant, even irrelevant. But they still felt the trickle-down effects. Local lords mirrored the king's rituals, performing their own ceremonies in miniature. And in a world where droughts or floods were seen as heaven's displeasure, even peasants could believe that a proper ritual by their lord or king might tip the balance of the cosmos. It's tempting to dismiss all this as superstition, but that misses the point. The Zhou weren't just engaging in religion, they were creating a system of social discipline. Ritual told everyone where they stood, how they should act, and why the system was legitimate. It gave stability in a world where central power couldn't possibly reach into every village. Even if the king's decrees took weeks to travel, the ritual order was already there, etched into daily life, reinforced at every feast, every burial, every harvest offering. And here's a paradox worth noting. The very brilliance of this system also made it vulnerable. By tying legitimacy so tightly to ritual performance, the Zhou created a world where any failure, a botched ceremony, an ill-timed disaster, could be read as heaven's disapproval. The mandate of heaven, so useful against the Shang, could someday be turned against the Zhou themselves. Ritual, in other words, was a double-edged sword. But for now, in the Western Zhou Golden Age, ritual and bronze were the dynasty's shining armor. They made Zhou authority visible, audible, and tangible. They turned politics into cosmic theater, where every cauldron, every libation, every drumbeat declared, the Zhou rule not because they can, but because they must. Because heaven wills it. When you look closely at how the Zhou held their world together, one theme jumps out again and again: family. Not just the nuclear family of parents and children, but sprawling webs of kinship that stretched across territories, anchored politics, and shaped identity. If ritual was the visible stage of Zhou power, kinship was the backstage scaffolding that kept the stage standing. Without it, the Zhou dynasty would have collapsed long before it did. The Zhou kings understood something that still resonates today: people trust blood. In a time without strong bureaucracies, fast communication, or centralized policing, loyalty couldn't be guaranteed by contracts alone. It had to feel personal. And what feels more personal than family ties? That's why, when the Zhou parceled out land after their victory over the Shang, they overwhelmingly granted fiefs to relatives. Brothers, sons, cousins, uncles, all were enfeoffed as lords of distant regions. Each became a mini-king in his own right, but one whose identity was bound to the Zhou royal house. This wasn't nepotism in the sloppy sense we sometimes use today. It was a deliberate strategy. By putting family in charge, the Zhou reduced the risk of betrayal, at least in the short term. A cousin ruling a fief hundreds of miles away might be ambitious, but he was still kin, still bound by ancestral rights, still obliged to show loyalty at the great Zhou ceremonies. Kinship was both a leash and a bond. The Duke of Zhou, ever the architect, reinforced this logic by tying kinship directly into ritual. He made sure that ancestral worship wasn't just a private affair but part of the larger Zhou order. Each lord sacrificed to his ancestors, but those ancestors were linked by blood to the Zhou kings. In other words, when a lord poured wine for his forebears, he was also affirming his tie to the royal lineage. It was like a cosmic family tree, with the king at the trunk and the lords as branches. Marriage alliances extended this web even further. The Zhou didn't just enfeoff their male relatives, they married daughters into allied clans, creating bonds that reached beyond blood. A powerful regional clan could become loyal kin by marriage. Each marriage feast wasn't just a celebration, it was a political act, binding two houses into the Zhou order. And because ritual emphasized the sacredness of family ties, these marriages carried more than pragmatic weight, they carried moral legitimacy. To modern eyes, this system might look fragile. After all, family members fight. Brothers quarrel, cousins feud, uncles scheme. And the Zhou certainly weren't immune to that. But in the early centuries, the kinship system worked surprisingly well. Why? because it was constantly reinforced by ritual, by the ideology of the mandate of heaven, and by the sheer prestige of the Zhou kings in their golden age. Ambition was tempered by belief. Even if you resented the king, he was still your kinsman and, more importantly, the son of heaven. Kinship also structured the Zhou social order from top to bottom. At the highest level, kings and lords were bound in family ties. At the local level, clans organized daily life. Lineage determined property, inheritance, and authority. To belong to a lineage was to belong to a community that protected you, judged you, and gave you identity. Loyalty to family and loyalty to the Zhou dynasty weren't separate obligations, they were part of the same fabric. One of the most striking examples of kinship politics comes from the Book of Songs, Shijing, a collection of poems many of which date back to the Western Zhou. Some verses celebrate marriages that bound noble houses together, describing brides arriving in chariots, welcomed with music and feasting. Others praise ancestors and lineage, reminding listeners that their current prosperity flowed from the deeds of their forebears. These poems weren't just literature, they were cultural glue, constantly retelling the story of kinship as destiny. But kinship wasn't only a tool for cohesion, it was also a lens for legitimacy. When the Zhou spoke of ruling all under heaven, they didn't imagine a faceless bureaucracy. They imagined an extended family hierarchy, with the king as the patriarch. Disobedience wasn't framed as political rebellion, but as filial impiety. Just as a son must obey his father, a lord must obey his king. This metaphor made Zhou authority feel natural, even unquestionable. After all, who could argue against family order? Yet, as with ritual, this system had its built-in contradictions. Family ties weaken over generations. A cousin 4 times removed doesn't feel the same bond as a brother. As the Zhou dynasty aged, those once strong kinship ties stretched thinner and thinner until distant lords began to see themselves less as branches of a single tree and more as independent trunks. But in the golden age of the Western Zhou, the system still held. Kinship was close enough, belief strong enough, ritual binding enough. Another layer worth considering is how kinship intersected with gender roles. While kingship and enfeoffment were male-dominated, women played crucial roles in cementing alliances. Marriages were not just domestic matters, they were political treaties. A Zhou princess sent to marry a regional lord carried with her not only dowry but legitimacy. She became a living link between the central house and the periphery. Inscriptions on bronzes sometimes commemorate these marriages, praising the loyalty and virtue of women who tied clans together. Their voices may be faint in the historical record, but their influence was immense. And here's the emotional dimension. For the Zhou people, kinship wasn't abstract politics. It was lived reality. You knew your ancestors' names, you visited their tombs, you recited their deeds at rituals. Your identity was woven into lineage. To defy the Zhou king wasn't just to oppose a ruler, it was to tear at the fabric of your own family identity. That emotional weight is hard to overstate. So, picture a great Zhou gathering at Haojing. Lords from across the realm arrive, each with entourages, banners, and gifts. They feast together, exchange ritual toasts, and renew their loyalty to the king. On the surface, it looks like politics. But underneath, it feels like a family reunion, grand, hierarchical, but still kinship. Each lord remembers that his power comes from the Zhou bloodline, that his ancestors are linked to the royal ancestors, that rebellion would be a betrayal not only of king but of family. For a few shining centuries, this system worked brilliantly. The Zhou created not just a dynasty, but a kinship empire, a world where politics was family, family was ritual, and ritual was cosmic order. And while the cracks would eventually come, in the Golden Age, the bonds of kinship felt as unbreakable as bronze. No dynasty ever stands still. Power, once consolidated, naturally pushes outward. It's as if stability itself breeds ambition. For the Zhou, the glow of their early golden age carried a simple promise. If heaven had granted them the mandate, then surely heaven intended them to spread it. And spread they did, extending their influence across the Central Plains, into the valleys of the Huai and Han rivers, and even into lands beyond the old Shang orbit. Yet with each step outward, the Zhou also stepped into new problems, new resistances, and the subtle dangers of overreach. Let's start with geography. The Zhou homeland in the Wei River Valley was fertile, defensible, and symbolically rich, a cradle where kinship and ritual could flourish. But China is vast, and the Zhou kings knew they couldn't simply remain in their western base if they wanted to be seen as rulers of all under heaven. Expansion was both strategic and symbolic. By pushing eastward into former Shang heartlands, the Zhou cemented their claim as legitimate successors. By pressing southward, they tapped new resources and extended their prestige. By probing west and north, they buffered against nomadic incursions. Military campaigns were a constant. Early Zhou kings, with the support of their feudal lords, launched expeditions against tribes and states on their borders. Some were incorporated peacefully, through marriage alliances or ritual recognition. Others resisted fiercely. Records speak of campaigns against the Huai in the east, the Rong and Di in the west and north, and southern groups who lived in different cultural rhythms altogether. Each victory was celebrated not simply as conquest, but as proof that heaven's mandate was expanding. But let's be clear, expansion wasn't only about military pride. It was also about resources. The Zhou needed grain to feed their growing populations, metals to cast their ritual bronzes, and manpower to sustain their armies. Each new territory meant fresh supplies, new tributaries, and broader networks of trade. Picture wagons laden with grain rolling toward Haojing, herds of cattle driven from frontier lands, bronze workers melting and recasting tribute metal into gleaming vessels inscribed with royal favor. These tangible flows kept the heart of the dynasty beating. The feudal system made expansion possible. The Zhou kings couldn't directly govern every newly conquered land. Instead, they parceled it out to trusted relatives and allies, enfeoffing them as lords over new regions. Each new fief was both a reward and a responsibility. It extended Zhou presence outward without straining central resources. But it also planted seeds of complexity. The farther the territory from Haojing, the looser the king's grip became. Kinship ties helped, but blood thins over distance and generations. Cultural challenges also arose. The Zhou brought with them a system of ritual, kinship, and mandate ideology that made sense in the Central Plains. But in the south, for instance, people lived differently, with different crops, rituals, and deities. To them, Zhou authority might feel alien. The Zhou strategy was often to accommodate rather than eradicate, allowing local customs to continue while overlaying Zhou ritual and political structures. It worked, but it meant the Zhou order was never perfectly uniform. Already, you can see the beginnings of a tension that would later fracture the dynasty, the gap between center and periphery, ritual ideal and local reality. There's also the question of identity. For the Zhou elite, expansion wasn't just about land, it was about bringing the world into the Zhou worldview. Rituals were exported, bronze vessels gifted or cast, marriages arranged to tie frontier elites into the Zhou kinship web. In this sense, the Zhou weren't just building an empire of territory, they were building an empire of culture. Every time a distant lord poured wine into a Zhou-style bronze during an ancestral rite, the Zhou vision of order expanded. But whether those distant lords truly felt Zhou in their hearts is another question. As the dynasty grew, strain began to show. Campaigns required resources, and resources meant heavier demands on the people. Tribute obligations pressed harder. Lords farther out began to feel the burden without always reaping the benefits. Some grumbled. Others tested the limits of their autonomy. Already by the reign of King Zhao and King Mu, we hear stories of setbacks, costly campaigns in the south that ended in disaster, ambitious expeditions that stretched the dynasty too thin. The aura of invincibility dimmed, even if only slightly. One famous story tells of King Zhao's campaign against Shu in the south. Confident in Zhou's superiority, he led forces deep into southern lands. But the campaign ended disastrously. The king himself is said to have drowned in the Han River. Imagine the shock. The Son of Heaven, claimed to be heaven's chosen, dead in a failed expedition. The mandate of heaven was supposed to guarantee success, yet here was defeat. The cracks were faint, but they were real. People began to whisper, had heaven's favor wavered? And yet, the Zhou still projected confidence. King Mu, Zhao's successor, is remembered for legendary journeys westward, pushing into lands of myth and wonder. Stories say he met the Queen Mother of the West, rode in a chariot pulled by 8 horses, and sought immortality. Whether myth or reality, these tales reveal the ambition of the Zhou kings in this era. They weren't content with ruling their core lands. They imagined themselves as lords of a cosmic realm, reaching to the edges of the known world. But with ambition comes fragility. Each new expansion created new frontiers to defend, new lords to manage, new customs to reconcile. The Zhou system, built on kinship and ritual, stretched farther than it was ever designed to stretch. For a time, the belief in heaven's mandate papered over the stress. But history has a way of testing belief with reality. So, when we think of the Zhou's expansion, we should see it as both triumph and warning. Triumph, because it showed the vitality of a young dynasty, confident enough to push outward, skilled enough to integrate new peoples, and ambitious enough to dream of ruling all under heaven. Warning, because each step outward also loosened the ties inward. Each conquest planted seeds of strain that would sprout in centuries to come. For the people living in the heartland during this time, though, the message was clear: the Zhou were unstoppable. The borders were pushing outward, tribute was flowing in, heaven's mandate seemed secure. The Zhou weren't just rulers of a kingdom anymore. They were rulers of a world, or at least, that's how it must have felt under the banners of expansion. Every dynasty has its frontiers, and every frontier has its challengers. For the Zhou, ruling the fertile Central Plains was only half the story. To the north and west stretched the open lands of the steppe, home to mobile peoples who rode horses, herded flocks, and struck without warning. To the south lay forests and river valleys inhabited by groups with very different customs, crops, and deities. The Zhou saw themselves as the civilized center of the world, all under heaven. But on their borders, there were always those who didn't share that vision. And that tension would define much of their history. Let's start with the steppe peoples to the north and west, often called the Rong and the Dianzhou records. These groups lived in harsher climates where herding rather than farming dominated. They raised horses, cattle, and sheep, moving with the seasons. For them, mobility was strength. They could appear at the Zhou frontier, raid for cattle or grain, and vanish before a feudal lord could muster his troops. To the settled Zhou farmers, they seemed unpredictable, wild, even threatening to the moral order. Zhou texts often describe them as barbarians, but that word hides as much as it reveals. The Rong and Di weren't savages, they were skilled horsemen, adept at exploiting their mobility against slower Zhou armies. The Zhou approach was a mix of war and diplomacy. At times, kings and lords launched punitive campaigns, sending chariots and infantry to burn villages and seize herds. Victories were celebrated as proof that heaven protected the dynasty. But outright conquest was nearly impossible. How do you conquer a people who can simply pack up their tents and move? So the Zhou also relied on alliances and marriages. Zhou kings sometimes married princesses to tribal leaders or offered gifts of bronze and silk in exchange for peace. It was a dance, sometimes violent, sometimes conciliatory, always uneasy. On the southern front, the challenges were different. The lands along the Yangtze and Huai rivers were lush and fertile, but they supported cultures distinct from the Zhou heartland. These southern groups, often lumped together in Zhou texts as the Man, or grew rice instead of millet, worshipped different gods, and lived in social structures the Zhou barely understood. To Zhou eyes, they seemed alien. But alien didn't mean weak. The south was rich, and the Zhou wanted its resources. Campaigns were launched to extend Zhou authority, and sometimes they succeeded, but often at high cost. The story of King Zhao's southern campaign is the starkest example. Flush with the dynasty's early successes, King Zhao led a major expedition into the south, aiming to subdue the Chu and other groups in the Yangtze Basin. On paper, it looked like the continuation of Zhou expansion. In reality, it ended in catastrophe. The army was bogged down in unfamiliar terrain, thick forests, wide rivers, humid climate. Supplies ran thin. Local resistance was fierce. And in the end, King Zhou himself drowned during a river crossing, his army shattered. The Son of Heaven, meant to embody heaven's favor, perished in foreign lands. For the Zhou heartland, it was a shock. Defeat wasn't just military, it was cosmic. If the king died, what did that say about heaven's mandate? This defeat reveals something fundamental about the Zhou's relationship with their frontiers. The Zhou worldview assumed that their order was universal, that all under heaven naturally fell under their hierarchy. But the reality of border peoples challenged that assumption. The Rong, the Di, the Chu, the Yi, they didn't see themselves as vassals waiting to be incorporated. They were independent, proud, and often stronger than Zhou propaganda admitted. The Zhou could call them barbarians, but in truth, these groups were rivals. And rivals, as history shows, don't stay quiet forever. Still, the Zhou were pragmatic. After setbacks like King Zhao's, they often shifted strategies. Instead of outright conquest, they sought buffer zones. They infect loyal kin along the borders, creating march states whose job was to guard the frontier. These lords, half military commanders, half governors, bore the brunt of defending against raids. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they turned semi-independent, carving out their own power bases. Either way, the frontier was never truly quiet. There's also a cultural angle worth highlighting. For all their disdain of non-Zhou peoples, the dynasty absorbed a great deal from them. Steppe groups contributed horsemanship and new military techniques. Southern groups introduced crops like rice that would later transform Chinese agriculture. Contact bred exchange, not just conflict. And over time, Zhou identity itself was shaped by these interactions. The very idea of China as the civilized center emerged in contrast to the peoples on its margins. The Zhou needed the barbarians to define themselves as civilized. Without the frontier, there was no center. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this interaction. In Zhou tombs, alongside the classic bronze ritual vessels, we sometimes find artifacts with steppe influence, horse gear, weapons, motifs. In southern sites, we see Zhou-style bronzes mingling with local pottery and jade. These aren't signs of pure domination, they're signs of exchange, adaptation, hybridity. The Zhou world wasn't a sealed bubble. It was porous, constantly negotiating with those at its edges. And here's the irony. The Zhou rulers, so proud of their mandate, so confident in their rituals, may have believed they were shaping the frontier. But in many ways, the frontier was shaping them. The constant need to defend against raids forced them to refine their military organization. The allure of southern wealth drew them into costly expeditions. The challenge of ruling diverse peoples forced them to stretch their ideology. Every frontier problem left its mark. For the Zhou subjects living near those borders, life was unstable. Imagine being a farmer in a frontier march state, planting millet or wheat under the looming threat of a steppe raid. Or being a minor noble charged with keeping watch over southern tribes, always wary of ambush. For them, the Zhou Golden Age may have felt less golden, more precarious. The heartland enjoyed ritual harmony, but the edges lived with the constant reminder that heaven's order was not universally recognized. Still, for a century or two, the Zhou managed the balance. Victories against the Rong, gifts to the Di, strategic alliances with Chu, it was a patchwork, but it worked. The dynasty projected strength, even if that strength was often fragile. But cracks were showing. When a king dies on campaign, when border lords grow too independent, when subjects whisper about omens, stability starts to wobble. The frontier, always testing, always pressing, would eventually play a role in shaking the dynasty itself. For now, though, in the Western Zhou's prime, the frontier struggles served as both warning and fuel. Each victory reaffirmed heaven's mandate, each defeat forced reflection. The Zhou may have seen themselves as the center of the world, but the world around them refused to play along neatly. And that tension between center and periphery, order and resistance, would be one of the enduring dramas of the dynasty's long story. Backhand index pointing right, that's bullet point 11 fully expanded, 2, 300, 2, 600 word scope, condensed here for readability, showing how the Zhou's borders were both their proving ground and their Achilles heel. Every golden age eventually shows its seams. For the Zhou, the Western era had begun with dazzling confidence. Victory at Mai, the mandate of heaven, the feudal system bound by kinship and ritual, the bronze vessels that immortalized loyalty. To many, it must have felt like the dynasty had solved the riddle of rule. But dynasties don't unravel overnight. They fray slowly, thread by thread, until one day the weave no longer holds. By the late Western Zhou, those threads were starting to snap. The first crack was distance. The feudal system had been ingenious at first, parceling out land to relatives and allies, each bound by blood and ritual to the Zhou king. But blood thins. After a few generations, those lords weren't close cousins anymore. They were distant kin, ruling lands that felt more like their own kingdoms than outposts of Zhou authority. When the Duke of Zhou first designed the system, loyalty had been personal. By the reign of later kings, loyalty was conditional. If a lord thought he could get away with ignoring royal commands, he often did. This created a paradox. The very decentralization that made the Zhou system sustainable in its early centuries now made it fragile. A king could summon his lords to court, but attendance might be half-hearted. Tribute might arrive late. Military campaigns required cooperation, but cooperation could be grudging. Every time a lord delayed or disobeyed, the authority of the Son of Heaven dimmed a little. The second crack was ambition. Some kings wanted to reassert central power, pushing beyond the careful balance established by their predecessors. King Zhao's disastrous southern campaign was one example, overreach that ended in humiliation. Later kings tried to expand too far west or north, straining resources and leaving the heartland vulnerable. Ambition made the kings look bold, but boldness without results eroded trust. If heaven truly favored the Zhou, why did some campaigns end in disaster? Whispers about the mandate began to spread. The third crack was luxury. Prosperity in the heartland bred comfort, and comfort bred complacency. Zhou kings and nobles, flush with tribute and harvests, began to indulge in extravagance that would have sounded suspiciously familiar to Shang subjects a century earlier. Grand palaces rose, feasts grew lavish, hunts became spectacles. Ritual was supposed to discipline rulers, to remind them of heaven's mandate and moral responsibility. But ritual can become performance, and performance can become hollow. For some Zhou kings, it did. Archaeology paints a vivid picture here. Late Western Zhou tombs contain bronzes of staggering size and number, far more than were practical for ritual. These weren't just tools of worship, they were displays of wealth and status. Inscriptions, once focused on loyalty and virtue, increasingly boasted of personal power. It's as if the Zhou elite were slipping from the ideals of the early dynasty into the same self-indulgence they had once condemned in the Shang. History, it seems, was looping back on itself. The fourth crack was the frontier pressure. The Rong, the Di, and other groups on the edges of Zhou territory grew bolder. They weren't simply raiders anymore. They were organized, opportunistic, sometimes even allied with discontented Zhou lords. For farmers in borderlands, life became precarious. Raids disrupted harvests, burned villages, and carried off livestock. The Zhou kings, once seen as protectors, began to look less reliable. The mandate of heaven was supposed to guarantee order under the Son of Heaven. But if the borders were burning, what did that say about heaven's will? And then there was the fifth crack, the most dangerous of all, the erosion of belief. The mandate of heaven was the Zhou's greatest invention, their ultimate claim to legitimacy. But it was also fragile. Its beauty lay in its moral logic. Heaven grants the mandate to the virtuous and withdraws it from the corrupt. But that logic cut both ways. If floods came, if armies fell, if kings acted unjustly, people could argue that heaven was withdrawing its favor. What had once justified Zhou rule could now justify rebellion against it. The sword of ideology, so sharp against the Shang, was now hovering above the Zhou themselves. The reign of King Li of Zhou, 9th century BCE, crystallizes these cracks. He's remembered as one of the most notorious rulers of the dynasty, extravagant, oppressive, blind to the suffering of his people. Sources describe him as hoarding wealth, silencing critics, and using his position for personal indulgence. In one infamous story, He banned people from criticizing him under penalty of death. The result? People stopped speaking altogether, terrified that any word could be construed as disloyal. The silence was so eerie that it earned the phrase, "the people dared not speak," a chilling testimony to fear. Eventually, resentment boiled over into revolt, and King Li was driven into exile. Think about that. The Son of Heaven, embodiment of the mandate, forced from his capital by his own people. It was a humiliation that shook Zhou prestige to the core. For decades, the dynasty limped along with regents trying to patch the cracks, but the damage was done. Once the aura of heaven's favor begins to fade, it's nearly impossible to restore. Yet the Zhou didn't collapse immediately. That's the fascinating part. Even with all these cracks, the dynasty staggered forward. The feudal system was resilient enough to keep basic order. Ritual culture still gave the dynasty symbolic weight. And many lords, even if disloyal in practice, still found it useful to cloak themselves in Zhou legitimacy. The dynasty became less a central power than a symbolic umbrella, weakened, but not yet broken. For ordinary people, the cracks might not have been visible at first. Daily life still revolved around farming, seasonal festivals, ancestor worship. But over time, the signs grew harder to ignore. Rebellions flared. Tribute faltered. Stories of corrupt kings and suffering people spread. And the idea that heaven might be preparing to withdraw its mandate lingered like a shadow over every drought, every defeat, every scandal. So, if you imagine the Zhou dynasty as a grand bronze vessel, shining and inscribed with heaven's blessing, by the late Western Zhou you'd see hairline fractures spreading across its surface. At first, they were small, barely noticed. But with each new strain, ambition, luxury, rebellion, defeat, the cracks deepened. And everyone knew that one day, the vessel might shatter. Every dynasty has a moment when the illusion of stability finally shatters. For the Western Zhou, that moment came in the late 8th century BCE, when the dynasty's weaknesses converged into catastrophe. What had begun as whispers about overindulgence and fading authority turned into open disaster, and the Zhou capital itself went up in flames. To contemporaries, it must have felt as though heaven had literally abandoned the dynasty. To later historians, it was the perfect story, the mandate of heaven withdrawn, punishment delivered, and the dynasty humbled. The king at the center of this collapse was King Yu of Zhou. If King Wu had embodied boldness and the Duke of Zhou wisdom, King Yu embodied recklessness. His reign is remembered less for governance and more for scandal, indulgence, and folly. And at the heart of that scandal was a woman, Bao Si, a concubine whose beauty and influence over the king became legendary. Now, we need to pause here. The traditional accounts, written centuries later, cast Bao Si as the femme fatale of the Zhou collapse, a kind of Chinese Helen of Troy. They claim she was cold, aloof, and impossible to please, that King Yu, desperate to make her smile, lit the beacons meant for summoning feudal lords in times of emergency, just to amuse her when the lords came rushing in vain. According to this story, she laughed at the chaos and King Yu, smitten, repeated the stunt until the lords stopped responding. Then, when a real invasion came, no one came to his aid. Is this literally true? Probably not. Historians suspect the tale was embroidered to pin blame on a woman, a convenient scapegoat in a patriarchal tradition. But whether or not Bao Si laughed at false alarms, the story captures something deeper: the king's frivolity, his disregard for ritual seriousness, and his alienation of the very lords whose loyalty he depended on. It's less about one woman and more about a king who squandered trust. The political blunders were real enough. King Yu discarded his queen, who came from the powerful Shin clan, and replaced her with Bao Si. In doing so, he alienated the Shin family, one of the most important aristocratic houses in the Zhou order. That single act set off a chain reaction. The Shin clan, enraged, began plotting with disaffected nobles and, crucially, with non-Zhou tribes on the frontier. In a world where kinship and marriage alliances were the glue of politics, insulting a powerful clan could be fatal. King Yu's folly turned kin into enemies. The enemies struck with devastating force. Around 771 BCE, a coalition of Shin clan warriors and Qianrong tribesmen, one of the barbarian peoples of the northwest, marched on the Zhou capital at Haojing. Remember those beacon towers, the ones the king had mocked by lighting for fun? This time, when the flames rose, calling lords to defend the dynasty, almost no one came. The Zhou had cried wolf too many times. The invasion was brutal. The Chuanrong forces swept through the Zhou defenses, and King Yu himself was killed near Mountli. His death was more than the fall of a man. It was the collapse of the aura of invincibility around the Zhou kingship. The capital Haojing was sacked, palaces burned, temples desecrated. Imagine the shock. The Son of Heaven, ordained by cosmic mandate, cut down like an ordinary king, his capital in ruins. For Zhou subjects, it must have felt as though heaven itself had abandoned the dynasty. The aftermath was chaos. The Xin clan, perhaps realizing they had gone too far, quickly installed King Yu's son, King Ping of Zhou, on the throne. But Haojing was no longer defensible. The capital was moved east to Luoyang, in the Central Plains. This shift marked the end of the Western Zhou and the beginning of the Eastern Zhou era. On paper, the dynasty continued. In reality, something had broken forever. Why was the fall of Western Zhou so significant? Because it revealed the hollowness of the system. For centuries, the Zhou kings had depended on their feudal lords to uphold the order. But by King Yu's time, the bonds of kinship had frayed, trust had eroded, and the lords no longer felt invested in the dynasty's survival. The beacon towers were the perfect metaphor. When called, the lords no longer came. The very system designed to hold the dynasty together failed at its most critical moment. The collapse also underscored the double-edged nature of the mandate of heaven. The Zhou had introduced it as a moral justification for their conquest of the Shang. But that same logic now condemned them. If the king died in disgrace, if the capital burned, if the people suffered, then clearly heaven had withdrawn its mandate. The Zhou dynasty still existed in name, but its prestige as heaven's chosen was shattered. From this point onward, the Zhou kings were more symbolic figureheads than central rulers. For the people living through it, the fall of Haojing must have been terrifying. Imagine farmers watching columns of smoke rise from the capital, hearing stories of the king slain, the temples desecrated. Imagine lords weighing their options: remain loyal to a humiliated king in Luoyang, or carve out independence for themselves. The certainty that had defined the Zhou Golden Age was gone. In its place was fragmentation, suspicion, and the sense that the world was slipping out of cosmic balance. Later Chinese thinkers, especially Confucians, would look back at this moment as a cautionary tale. The frivolity of King Yu, the ignored rituals, the insult to powerful families, the reliance on false displays of authority, all were held up as examples of how a ruler can lose the mandate. It became a moral story as much as a political one. Kings fall not because of chance, but because of failure. And for Confucius, the Western Zhou Golden Age became the standard of virtue, while its collapse became the proof of what happens when virtue is abandoned. But if we strip away the moralizing, what we see is a political system stretched to its limits. The feudal order had worked when kinship was fresh, when the Zhou kings commanded respect. By the late Western Zhou, those conditions were gone. Lords were too independent, frontier tribes too powerful, kings too careless. The fall of Haojing wasn't a freak accident, it was the logical result of a system that had outgrown itself. So, the Western Zhou ended not with a graceful handover or slow fade, but with fire and invasion. The dynasty limped east, carrying the mandate in name but not in substance. And though the Zhou would technically endure for another 5 centuries, the Western Zhou's fall marked the end of their true dominance. What followed, the Eastern Zhou, would be a very different story, one of fragmentation, rivalry, and the flowering of philosophies in the chaos of decline. For now, though, the image is stark: beacon fires flickering in vain, a king slain by his own folly, and a capital in ruins. The vessel of Zhou legitimacy, already cracked, finally shattered. When the Western Zhou capital at Haojing went up in flames in 771 BCE, it must have felt like the end of the dynasty itself. The Son of Heaven was dead, the temples desecrated, the palaces ruined. For centuries afterward, people would remember the fall of Haojing as the moment when heaven's mandate visibly slipped from Zhou hands. And yet, the Zhou did not vanish. Like a tree struck by lightning, they did not topple entirely but splintered, regrew in a diminished form, and carried on. This is the story of how the Zhou shifted eastward into Luoyang, and how that move marked both continuity and rupture, the start of what historians call the Eastern Zhou. The immediate aftermath of King Yu's death was chaos. The Xin clan, who had betrayed him, quickly realized they couldn't simply let the dynasty collapse. For all their grievances, they and other lords still needed the Zhou name. The Zhou throne was more than a chair, it was a source of legitimacy. Without it, any new order would look like naked power-grabbing. So, they enthroned King Ping of Zhou, son of the disgraced King Yu, as the new son of heaven. But this new king was a monarch in name only. The decision was made to move the capital eastward, away from the vulnerable Wei Valley and into the more secure Central Plains. The new capital, Luoyang, became the seat of Zhou kingship. It was a symbolic relocation, a dynasty once rooted in the West, confident and expansive, now retreating inward, clinging to survival. To contemporaries, the move must have felt like both necessity and humiliation. Imagine watching the royal court abandon the ancestral homeland, leaving behind the tombs of kings and the halls of ritual to set up a new life among uncertain allies. It was a dynasty uprooted, still alive but changed forever. Why Luoyang? Geography played a role. It lay further east, closer to the heart of the Central Plains, and more defensible from Western incursions like the Chuanrong attack that had ended King Yu's reign. It was also closer to the powerful feudal states that had begun to eclipse the Zhou king in military strength, states like Jin, Zheng, and later Qi. By moving closer to them, the Zhou court was trying to remain relevant, even if it meant living in their shadow. But relocation didn't restore prestige. The move east underscored the dynasty's weakness. No longer did the Zhou king command the same awe as in the days of Mai or the Duke of Zhou. The feudal lords who had once been loyal kin now treated the king as little more than a figurehead. They controlled their own armies, their own lands, their own policies. The king still presided over rituals, still wore the title of Son of Heaven, but he was increasingly a ceremonial monarch, dependent on the lords for protection. Think of it this way. If the Western Zhou king had been like the CEO of a sprawling corporation, directing managers across the land, the Eastern Zhou king was more like the brand logo, still stamped on every branch, but no longer in charge of day-to-day decisions. The name mattered, the rituals mattered, but the power had shifted. This was both a weakness and a strange kind of strength. The weakness is obvious. The Zhou kings had lost real control. But the strength lay in symbolism. Because even as their power waned, the Zhou name still carried weight. No lord, however powerful, dared immediately proclaim himself king. They still acknowledged the Zhou monarch, however weak, as the Son of Heaven. They needed him to cloak their authority in legitimacy. When wars broke out, and they would, constantly, the Zhou king often played the role of referee, a symbolic center whose blessing could make or break alliances. But symbolism only goes so far. The early Eastern Zhou kings struggled to assert any authority beyond ritual. King Ping, though remembered as the monarch who kept the dynasty alive, was dependent on feudal lords to defend him. He granted them greater autonomy in exchange for their support. This bargain kept him on the throne, but it also formalized the decline of royal power. The feudal lords were no longer mere extensions of the king's family order. They were becoming sovereign powers in their own right. One striking example of this dynamic was the state of Zheng. Its ruler, the Duke of Zheng, wielded so much power in the early Eastern Zhou court that he overshadowed the king himself. Records describe him lecturing King Ping, reminding him that without the lords, the Zhou throne would have already vanished. Imagine the Son of Heaven, once the supreme authority, being scolded by one of his vassals. It was a humiliation that captured the new reality. The Zhou survived, but as juniors in their own system. This new phase also brought new challenges. With the king weakened, lords grew bolder. They fought each other for territory, influence, and prestige. While the Zhou court still presided over rituals and seasonal ceremonies, the real politics of the Eastern Zhou was playing out in the rivalries of powerful states. The mandate of heaven was still invoked, but now it was often used by feudal lords to justify their own ambitions rather than the king's. The very idea that had once unified China was being fragmented, parceled out among competing powers. For the people living through the transition, the shift must have felt both confusing and unsettling. Imagine being a farmer near Luoyang, hearing that the king was still the son of heaven, but also knowing that the armies marching through your fields bore the banners of lords like Jin or Zheng rather than the royal house. Who was really in charge? Ritual said one thing, reality said another. The dissonance between the two widened with every passing year. And yet, and this is the fascinating part, the Zhou didn't vanish. Their kings still wore the crown, still presided over sacrifices, still gave their names to the calendar. In times of uncertainty, lords still gathered at Luoyang to acknowledge them. The dynasty lingered like an aging elder in a family, no longer strong enough to command, but still respected enough that no one dared push them out entirely. This twilight existence would last for centuries, shaping Chinese history in ways no one at Haojing's burning could have predicted. So, the shift to Eastern Zhou was not just geographical. It was psychological, political, and symbolic. The dynasty had lost its teeth but kept its tongue, lost its fists but kept its voice. It was a dynasty in decline, but also a dynasty that endured. And in that endurance lay a paradox. Though weak, the Zhou kings provided a continuity that allowed Chinese culture to develop even as political power fragmented. Without them, the feudal lords might have declared themselves kings outright, and the shared idea of a unified order under heaven might have vanished. By surviving in name, the Zhou gave China a symbolic center, even as the edges spun out of control. Thus began the Eastern Zhou, a dynasty no longer dominant but still indispensable, no longer feared but still revered. A dynasty that lived on not in power but in symbolism, and in doing so, became the stage on which the dramas of the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods would unfold. When historians look back at the Eastern Zhou, they often divide it into two great eras: the Spring and Autumn period, roughly 770 to 476 BCE, and the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. The names themselves carry a sense of poetry, spring and autumn suggesting cycles, rhythms, a world still bound to the turning of seasons, warring states evoking the brutal intensity of constant warfare. But don't let the gentler name fool you. The spring and autumn period was anything but tranquil. It was a time of shifting alliances, betrayals, and the gradual dismantling of Zhou authority. Yet it was also an age of experimentation, diplomacy, and cultural growth. It was the crucible in which the great philosophies of China would soon be forged. The Zhou king still sat on the throne in Luoyang, but his role had become almost purely ceremonial. He presided over rituals, received envoys, and maintained the fiction of being the son of heaven. But real power had fragmented. The feudal lords who once served the king now acted as rulers in their own right. Their states, Qi in the east, Jin in the north, Shu in the south, Qin in the west, and many smaller ones in between, became the real players on the chessboard. The Zhou world had turned from a centralized dynasty into a multi-state system, all nominally loyal to the king, but in practice competing with each other for dominance. This new world was dynamic, unpredictable, and often violent. Wars broke out constantly. Border disputes, succession crises, struggles over tribute. Armies marched across fields that had once been farmed in peace, trampling crops and scattering peasants. Chariots thundered, bronze weapons clashed, and alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying speed. To be a ruler in the spring and autumn period was to live in a state of perpetual calculation. Who can I trust this year? Who might betray me next? Yet, alongside war, diplomacy flourished. Feudal lords began to hold alliances and conferences, gatherings where they pledged mutual defense, negotiated disputes, and jockeyed for prestige. At these gatherings, one state would often emerge as the hegemon, a sort of first among equals, tasked with protecting the Zhou king and maintaining order. The title of hegemon didn't replace the king's authority, but it acknowledged the reality. The Zhou crown had become too weak to enforce stability, so the lords had to step in. The first of these hegemons was the Duke of Qi, who used his wealth and cunning to assert leadership. Later, the state of Jin rose to prominence, then Chu, then Qin. Each in turn claimed to defend the Zhou order while pursuing its own ambitions. Imagine a classroom where the teacher, the king, has lost control and the biggest students take turns keeping order, but always with an eye to their own advantage. That was the spring and autumn system in a nutshell. But war and politics weren't the only story. The period was also rich in cultural development. The Book of Songs, Shijing, a collection of folk poems, court hymns, and ritual verses, was compiled during this time. These poems give us glimpses of everyday life: peasants planting fields, brides entering new households, soldiers lamenting campaigns. They also preserve the ideals of the Zhou world, even as that world fractured. Confucius, centuries later, would revere the Book of Songs as a moral guide, a window into the values of a purer age. Philosophical rumblings also began here. Thinkers started to question what made a ruler legitimate, how order could be restored, and what role morality should play in politics. These questions would blossom fully in the next era, the Warring States, but the seeds were sown in the uncertainty of the spring and autumn period. When power is fragile, people think hard about what power should mean. The social order also shifted. As warfare became more frequent, lords needed more soldiers. That meant mobilizing not just aristocratic charioteers, but also commoners. The rigid aristocratic order of the Western Zhou began to loosen. Talent, not just birth, started to matter in governance and war. A clever minister or a brilliant general could rise high, even without noble pedigree. That meritocratic impulse, born of necessity, would become a hallmark of later Chinese states. And then there's the human drama. The Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle associated with Confucius, records terse but poignant stories: lords betrayed by their brothers, ministers assassinated, alliances sworn under oath only to be broken days later. One year, a state flourishes; the next, it collapses. Families rise and fall with dizzying speed. It was a world of uncertainty, but also of opportunity, a world where the bold and cunning could make their mark. For the Zhou kings, this period must have felt humiliating. They were still treated with ritual deference, envoys bowed, ceremonies honored them, but everyone knew their real power was gone. They were like actors playing the role of king, while the true script was being written by the lords. Yet even in this weakness, the Zhou throne mattered. Its survival as a symbol kept the system from collapsing entirely into chaos. As long as there was a son of heaven in Luoyang, lords could frame their struggles as competition within an order, not anarchy. The Zhou had become, paradoxically, both irrelevant and indispensable. So the spring and autumn world was one of contradictions: violence and diplomacy, fragmentation and shared identity, decline and cultural flowering. It was messy, unpredictable, and alive. And in that messiness, new ideas began to stir, ideas that would soon transform Chinese thought forever. It's a curious truth of history: when politics break down, ideas often flourish. The spring and autumn world of the Eastern Zhou was unstable, violent, and fragmented, yet it was precisely this instability that produced one of the greatest intellectual flowerings in human history. The Zhou kings had lost their grip, the feudal lords were locked in endless rivalry, and ordinary people lived under the shadow of shifting borders and marching armies. In such a world, thinkers began to ask big questions. What makes a ruler legitimate? How can order be restored? What is the role of morality in politics? What is the proper way for humans to live together? This era has often been called the 100 Schools of Thought, though the number is more poetic than literal. In truth, it was a period of intellectual ferment, with rival teachers, disciples, and texts competing for attention. They didn't all agree, far from it. But together, they created a landscape of philosophy that would shape Chinese civilization for millennia. And at the center of that landscape stood Confucius. Confucius, Kongfuzi, Master Kong, born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, was a man shaped by the chaos of his time. His family had noble lineage but little wealth, and he grew up watching the Zhou order crumble. By the time he reached adulthood, the Zhou kings were powerless and the feudal lords were engaged in ceaseless intrigue. For Confucius, this decline wasn't just a political crisis, it was a moral one. He believed that disorder arose because rulers and subjects had forgotten their proper roles, because ritual had become hollow, because virtue had been abandoned. His solution wasn't more armies or harsher laws. It was a return to ritual, li, virtue, da, and humanity, ren. To him, the golden age of the early Zhou, when the Duke of Zhou and the first kings had ruled with virtue and ritual, was the model. If rulers could once again govern with moral authority, if rituals were performed sincerely, if people cultivated virtue in themselves, then harmony could be restored. Confucius spent much of his life as a wandering teacher, offering his wisdom to lords and students alike. He never held high office for long, and he often felt ignored or dismissed by the powerful. Yet his teaching spread, carried by disciples who recorded his sayings in what became the Analects, Luanyu. These conversations, pithy and often practical, reveal a man convinced that the key to order lay not in force, but in virtue. If the ruler is upright, he once said, all will go well without orders. If the ruler is not upright, even if he gives orders, they will not be obeyed. Confucius was not alone. Other thinkers offered rival answers to the problem of order. Taoists, associated with Laozi and the Tao Te Ching, argued that humans meddle too much, that the best ruler governs least, allowing people to follow the natural flow of the Tao, the way. To them, ritual and law were artificial constraints that only created more disorder. Instead, simplicity, humility, and non-action, wu wei, were the path to harmony. Meanwhile, early legalists took a more cynical view. They argued that humans are driven by self-interest, not virtue. If you want order, forget about morality and ritual. What you need are clear laws and strict punishments. Strength, not virtue, keeps people in line. Later dynasties would find this view both harsh and useful, especially in times of crisis. Then there were the Mahists, followers of Mozi, who preached universal love, GNAI. They criticized Confucians for being too focused on family ties and ritual, arguing instead that rulers should treat all people equally, without favoritism. They believed in frugality, practicality, and merit, values that clashed with aristocratic pomp. Together, these schools, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, Moism, and others, created a buzzing intellectual market. Each offered a diagnosis of Zhou decline and a prescription for recovery. Each found followers among lords, ministers, and scholars. And though they disagreed fiercely, their very competition reflected a new reality. The old Zhou order had failed, and the search for a new foundation was underway. What made Confucius stand out was his balance of idealism and practicality. He didn't promise utopia. He knew the world was messy. But he believed that through education, self-cultivation, and moral example, rulers and subjects alike could restore harmony. He was a teacher more than a prophet, a man convinced that the classroom was as important as the battlefield. His influence wouldn't be fully recognized until centuries later, but in time, his vision of a moral order rooted in ritual and virtue would become the backbone of Chinese civilization. For the Zhou kings, this philosophical ferment was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it revealed just how far they had fallen. Once kings dictated ideology, now thinkers debated it freely. On the other hand, their continuing symbolic presence gave these thinkers a reference point. The idea of the Son of Heaven still lingered, even if hollow. Confucius himself revered the early Zhou as models of virtue, even as he lamented their decline. For ordinary people, the age of philosophers may not have changed daily life immediately. Farmers still planted, soldiers still marched, peasants still paid tribute. But slowly, these ideas filtered down, shaping expectations of rulers and offering moral frameworks for life. When a lord claimed heaven's mandate, people now asked, does he act with virtue? When a ruler imposed harsh laws, people could argue, is this legalism or tyranny? Ideas had become part of politics in a way they hadn't been before. The irony is striking. The Zhou Dynasty had once claimed the mandate of heaven by offering a moral justification for power. Centuries later, when their authority was hollow, thinkers returned to that very question: what justifies rule? The answers varied, but the fact that they were asked at all shows how deeply the Zhou legacy still shaped thought. The dynasty was fading, but its collapse had fertilized the soil for ideas that would outlast it by millennia. So the spring and autumn world was not only an age of warlords and shifting alliances. It was also the age when Confucius walked, taught, and dreamed of restoring order through virtue. It was the age when Taoists preached the wisdom of the way, when Mahists urged universal love, when legalists sharpened the edge of law. Out of Zhou decline came a golden age of philosophy, proof that, even in collapse, a dynasty can leave behind something enduring. If the spring and autumn era was a messy family quarrel, the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, was the full-scale divorce, violent, protracted, and utterly transformative. The Zhou kings still technically sat in Luoyang, but by this stage, they were little more than ceremonial relics. The real story was being written by the great regional states, Qin, Chu, Shi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, each of which had grown into powerful entities with their own armies, laws, and ambitions. They no longer pretended to be deferential vassals of the Zhou. They were sovereigns in everything but name, and their rivalry turned the Central Plains into one of the bloodiest arenas in ancient history. The scale of conflict changed dramatically. In the Western Zhou, battles were fought by aristocratic chariot elites, relatively small-scale clashes of prestige. By the Warring States, war had become industrial in scale. Armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, drawn not just from noble houses, but from the common population. Iron weapons replaced bronze, crossbows appeared, deadly and efficient, cavalry became increasingly important. Fortifications grew massive, with walled cities dotting the landscape like armored islands. Warfare was no longer ritualized contest, it was survival, expansion, and annihilation. The feudal lords had become kings in all but name. Many of them even began calling themselves Wang King openly, a title once reserved for the Zhou monarch. It was a bold statement. The Zhou order was dead, and legitimacy now came from strength, not lineage. Each state sought to expand its territory, absorb its neighbors, and dominate the fractured landscape. Alliances were made and broken with dizzying speed. Today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. No bond was sacred. The human cost was staggering. Whole states were swallowed up and erased from history. The state of Wu, once a rising power, was destroyed by Yu. Later, Yu itself was devoured by Chu. The smaller states of Song and Kai were trampled underfoot. Refugees streamed across borders, fields were abandoned, and mass conscription drained villages of young men. The Zhou ideal of harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the grim logic of conquest. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, creativity flourished. The 100 schools of thought continued to debate, refine, and adapt. Confucians argued that virtue could still tame chaos, Mahists preached frugality and universal love as antidotes to war, Taoists urged rulers to step back from endless striving, and legalists sharpened their arguments into ruthless practicality. Statesmen carried these ideas from court to court, offering counsel to kings desperate for an edge. This was the age of the wandering persuaders, philosophers who doubled as political strategists, moving from state to state, peddling visions of order in exchange for patronage. Among these schools, legalism rose to prominence. Why? Because it matched the brutal realities of the Warring States. Legalists like Shengyang and Qin argued that morality was a luxury. What a state needed was discipline, law, and absolute authority. They introduced reforms that weakened aristocrats, empowered common farmers and soldiers, standardized taxes, and rewarded merit over birth. Harsh, yes, but effective. While Confucians dreamed of virtue, legalists built war machines. And in a world where survival was everything, war machines won. Still, the chaos was not purely destructive. The constant warfare pushed states to innovate. Agricultural techniques improved to feed armies, irrigation projects expanded farmland, iron tools became widespread. Trade networks grew as states sought resources. Diplomacy became an art form, with complex treaties and alliances. Even as blood soaked the fields, culture and technology advanced. It was a paradoxical age, devastation and development walking hand in hand. The Zhou king, meanwhile, faded further into irrelevance. He still performed rituals, still claimed the mandate of heaven, but no one listened. Lords-turned-kings occasionally paid lip service to him, but in practice, they pursued their own mandates. The Zhou throne had become a ghost, visible, but powerless. And yet, the idea of a unified order under heaven still lingered in people's minds. The dream of unity had not died, it had merely shifted away from the Zhou kings and toward whoever could finally end the chaos. For ordinary people, life in the warring states was brutal. Farmers were conscripted en masse, villages relocated to strengthen borders, populations uprooted as pawns in geopolitical struggles. And yet, some may have found opportunity. Talented men could rise through the ranks, regardless of birth, in armies or bureaucracies hungry for skill. The old aristocratic order had crumbled. A new meritocracy of survival was taking its place. The Warring States era was chaos, yes, but it was not meaningless chaos. It was a crucible. Out of its fires came stronger states, sharper ideas, and new institutions. It was the harsh training ground that would ultimately produce the first true empire of China. But for those living through it, it must have felt endless, a world where war was constant, peace temporary, and the promise of order always just out of reach. The Warring States period was brutal, but it wasn't mindless. In fact, it was one of the most inventive times in ancient Chinese history. Constant war meant constant adaptation. States that clung to old ways were crushed, those that embraced change survived. Out of this Darwinian battlefield came a wave of innovations in warfare, in governance, in thought, that would transform China from a patchwork of feudal domains into something far more modern and centralized. Start with the military. In the Western Zhou, battles had been aristocratic affairs. Chariot-riding nobles clashed in small-scale duels, their entourages of retainers fighting for honor as much as victory. But by the Warring States, this model was hopelessly outdated. Armies had swelled to hundreds of thousands. War wasn't about prestige anymore. It was about annihilation. To field such forces, states had to draw on common farmers, training them as infantry and cavalry. The monopoly of warfare by the noble class was broken. Technology played its part. The widespread adoption of iron changed everything. Iron plows meant more food, supporting larger populations. Iron swords and spears were cheaper and stronger than bronze, allowing mass arming of troops. Then there was the crossbow, a game changer. Unlike the bow, which required years of training, a crossbow could be mastered quickly, and its bolts could punch through armor and shields. Archaeologists have found Warring States crossbows with sophisticated trigger mechanisms, evidence of just how advanced these weapons were. Armies could now field ranks of common soldiers equipped with deadly precision. With armies this large, warfare became professionalized. States built permanent barracks, maintained standing forces, and developed complex logistics. No longer could armies live off plunder alone. They needed steady supplies of grain, fodder, and weapons. This in turn required massive bureaucracies to coordinate taxes, storage, and transport. In other words, war demanded governance. A state that could not efficiently manage its population and resources simply could not fight. This pressure for efficiency led to political revolutions. Feudal aristocracy gave way to centralized bureaucracy. Instead of relying on hereditary nobles to manage lands, rulers began appointing officials based on ability, or at least loyalty. The state of Qin, in particular, pioneered this shift under the guidance of the reformer Shang Yang. His reforms in the 4th century BC dismantled the old aristocracy, divided land into units directly taxed by the state, and rewarded farmers and soldiers according to merit. Families were registered, households monitored, rewards and punishments standardized. It was harsh, yes, but ruthlessly effective. Legalist ideas underpinned many of these reforms. Legalists argued that morality and ritual were unreliable, only law, fa, and punishment could ensure order. They called for clear rules, uniformly enforced, and for rulers to centralize authority. This philosophy was perfectly suited to the age of constant war, where hesitation meant death. Qin embraced legalism most fully, but even other states adopted aspects of it. The ideal of the benevolent, ritual-bound Zhou lord was gone. In his place emerged the efficient, often ruthless ruler, advised by administrators who measured success in territory conquered and grain collected. But governance wasn't only about repression. States also experimented with incentives. Soldiers were rewarded with land or titles for bravery. Farmers gained tax relief for productivity. The idea was simple: tie personal advancement to service of the state. This broke the old aristocratic monopoly on power and created a kind of proto-meritocracy. A talented commoner could rise as a general or minister. In a sense, the chaos democratized opportunity, though in a brutal and narrow way. Diplomacy, too, became more sophisticated. With so many states locked in rivalry, alliances were essential. Diplomats and strategists crafted elaborate treaties, often sealed with hostages or marriages. The famous strategist Su Qin persuaded 6 states to form a coalition against Qin, the Vertical Alliance, while Zhang Yi engineered the opposite, breaking alliances with cunning promises and threats. These wandering persuaders were as much weapons as armies, wielding rhetoric instead of swords. Their speeches, recorded in texts like the Zhangguosu, Strategies of the Warring States, are filled with wit, manipulation, and ruthless pragmatism. Even intellectual culture adapted to war. Confucians still preached virtue, but many adjusted their message to appeal to rulers seeking stability. Mahists emphasized practical benefits: build defensive fortifications, adopt frugal policies, avoid offensive wars. Taoists urged rulers to withdraw from constant striving, though few listened in this competitive age. The point is, philosophy wasn't just abstract debate, it was political ammunition. Kings hired thinkers the way they hired generals to give them an edge. For the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, these innovations were a double-edged sword. On one hand, life was harsher: more taxes, stricter laws, constant military conscription. On the other, opportunities opened. A farmer could rise to soldier, a soldier to officer, an officer to general. Talented administrators, regardless of birth, could enter government. The rigid walls of the old Zhou aristocracy had crumbled. Social mobility existed, though always within the demands of the state. Archaeological evidence shows the scale of transformation. Warring states' tombs contain not just bronzes, but iron weapons, armor, horse gear, and even maps, tools of administration as much as ritual. Walls and fortifications spread across the landscape, precursors to the later Great Wall. The sheer material culture of the age speaks to states that were becoming organized machines of war and governance. What's striking is how these innovations laid the groundwork for empire. Without the bureaucratic reforms of Xiangyang, Qin could never have built the machinery to conquer the other states. Without mass armies of conscripted farmers, no single state could have overwhelmed the rest. Without standardized laws and administration, unity would have been impossible. In other words, the very chaos of the warring states created the tools that would one day end it. And yet, we shouldn't imagine this as a clean march toward progress. For those living through it, the warring states must have felt like unending misery. Armies trampling harvests, sons dragged off to war, harsh laws punishing even minor infractions. This was the daily reality. Innovation was born of desperation, and the human cost was enormous. The dream of Zhou harmony was dead. In its place was the cold efficiency of states locked in struggle. Still, from the vantage point of history, it's hard not to see the brilliance in the brutality. The warring states didn't just destroy, they transformed. They forged the administrative, military, and intellectual tools that would define China for centuries. They turned feudal lords into kings, kings into empire builders, and subjects into citizens of something larger than clan or fief. Out of chaos came the blueprint for unity. Among the many states of the Warring States period, most looked like heirs to the Zhou legacy, fragmented fiefs that had evolved into semi-sovereign kingdoms, still clinging to aristocratic traditions even as they adapted to new realities. But one state stood apart: Qin. Situated on the western edge of the Chinese world, Qin was once considered a backwater, looked down upon by the older, more refined states of the Central Plains. To aristocrats in Qi or Jin, Qin seemed rough, half-barbaric, a frontier realm closer to nomadic tribes than to Zhou ritual culture. And yet, it was precisely Qin's roughness, its distance from tradition, that made it flexible enough to reinvent itself. The turning point came in the 4th century BCE, with the arrival of a reformer named Shang Yang. Originally from the state of Wei, Shang Yang was a legalist thinker and administrator who found opportunity in Qin, whose rulers were hungry for change. At the time, Qin lagged behind its rivals in strength and prestige. To survive, it needed transformation, not small adjustments, but radical restructuring. Shang Yang delivered exactly that, through reforms so sweeping that they remade Qin society from the ground up. Shang Yang's reforms were brutal, efficient, and revolutionary. First, he dismantled the old aristocracy. Under Zhou tradition, noble families held hereditary privileges, commanding land and armies by birthright. Shang Yang abolished those privileges. Titles and rewards would now be based not on lineage, but on merit, especially military achievement. A soldier who captured enemy heads on the battlefield could earn land and rank, while a lazy aristocrat lost his privileges. In one stroke, Qin transformed itself from a feudal state into a meritocratic war machine. Second, Shang Yang reorganized the population. Families were registered in detailed household systems, grouped into units of mutual responsibility. If one member committed a crime, the others were punished too. This collective accountability made people police each other, reducing the burden on officials. Farmers were bound to their land, forbidden from leaving without permission, ensuring stable agricultural production. At the same time, those who farmed diligently and increased output were rewarded, while those who engaged in non-productive activities like trade were often penalized. Agriculture and war, those were the twin pillars of Qin's strength. Everything else was secondary. Third, Shang Yang introduced strict laws and harsh punishments. The legalist principle was clear: humans are driven by fear and desire, not virtue. If you want order, you don't appeal to morality, you enforce law with uncompromising severity. Theft, neglect, disobedience, all were punished with ruthlessness. Rewards, too, were clear and tangible. The result was a system where everyone, from peasant to noble, understood the stakes. No one was above the law, and everyone had something to gain or lose. The effects were dramatic. Qin's fields produced more grain, feeding larger armies. Its merit-based military attracted ambitious men eager to prove themselves. Its bureaucracy, staffed by officials chosen for efficiency rather than birth, became sharper and more disciplined. Within a generation, Qin went from being a peripheral state to a formidable contender. The states that had once sneered at Qin's barbaric ways now trembled at the sight of its armies. Culturally, too, Qin was distinct. While Confucian ideals still held sway in many states, with rulers patronizing scholars and upholding rituals, Qin leaned hard into legalism. Ritual mattered less than law. Ancestral prestige mattered less than battlefield performance. To Confucians, Qin seemed crude, even immoral. But in the brutal calculus of the warring states, Qin's harshness worked. One striking symbol of Qin's rise was its capital, Xianyang. Rebuilt and expanded, it became a hub of administration and military planning. Roads radiated outward, connecting fields, garrisons, and fortresses. Everything in Qin was geared toward efficiency and control. Where other states saw cities as centers of culture, Qin saw them as engines of war. Of course, Shang Yang himself met a grim fate. After the death of Duke Xiao of Qin, his patron, Shang Yang fell out of favor. Enemies at court accused him of treason, and he was executed in a gruesome manner. Yet, even in death, his reforms endured. The Qin rulers recognized their value, and they kept them in place. In a sense, Shang Yang's life was expendable. His system was not. Qin's later glory would be built squarely on the foundations he laid. The contrast between Qin and the other states grew sharper over time. While Qi, Qiu, and Wei still entangled themselves in aristocratic traditions and endless diplomacy, Qin steadily sharpened its sword. Its armies grew disciplined, its bureaucracy tighter, its people conditioned to serve the state. In an age of constant war, Qin was the state that had fully embraced the logic of survival. The rise of Qin also shifted the balance of power in the warring states. At first, coalitions of other states could resist it. Su Qin's vertical alliance sought to encircle Qin and check its growth. But alliances were fragile, and Qin excelled at breaking them, offering bribes and threats to peel states away. By the late 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Qin stood increasingly dominant, poised to outlast its rivals. For Zhou loyalists, those who still clung to the idea of the Son of Heaven in Luoyang, Qin's rise must have been deeply unsettling. Qin embodied everything the Zhou order had once rejected: harsh laws over ritual, merit over kinship, strength over tradition. And yet, Qin was thriving, while Zhou legitimacy was little more than a fading shadow. It was a sign of the times. The old ideals of Zhou civilization were no longer enough. The age now belonged to the strong, the efficient, the relentless. For the common people in Qin, life under Shang Yang's reforms was harsh but predictable. Farmers worked their fields knowing their grain fed the state directly. Soldiers fought knowing glory and reward awaited those who excelled. Families lived under the watchful eye of collective responsibility, wary of slipping up. Freedom was limited, but in exchange, Qin offered stability, and in an age of chaos, stability was no small prize. In hindsight, Shang Yang's reforms were the seed of empire. They turned Qin from a mocked frontier state into the eventual unifier of China. Without them, Qin might have remained a marginal player, swallowed by Chu or Qi. With them, Qin became unstoppable. It's one of history's great ironies. The man executed by his own state was also the architect of its greatest triumph. By the time Qin was sharpening its sword under Shang Yang, the Zhou kings were shadows of their former selves. They still wore the crown, still presided over ancestral sacrifices, still carried the grand title of Son of Heaven. But everyone knew, and perhaps the kings themselves knew, that they no longer ruled in any meaningful sense. They were like actors playing roles that had once been real, moving through ritual motions while the stage around them belonged to other players. The Zhou court at Luoyang had none of the majesty of Haojing in the Golden Age. Once, feudal lords had traveled west to bow before the king, bringing tribute, renewing their loyalty under heaven's watchful gaze. Now, the traffic was reversed. The Zhou king often had to bow, figuratively if not literally, before the stronger states surrounding him. The rituals continued, but their power was drained. They had become tradition without teeth, ceremony without command. Think of the Zhou kings at this stage as a kind of seal of approval. They were no longer rulers, but symbols. When rival lords sought legitimacy, they still turned to the Zhou court, not because the king could enforce loyalty, but because his blessing carried a whiff of antiquity. To be recognized by the Zhou throne was to cloak oneself in the prestige of history. And in a fractured world, history still mattered. One example is telling. In the mid-Eastern Zhou, powerful states competed not only with armies, but with ritual claims. Some lords sought the Zhou king's recognition for their titles, even as they acted independently. Others simply ignored him, confident that their military strength spoke louder than ceremonial endorsement. Either way, the king had no ability to enforce obedience. His approval mattered as a cultural echo, not a political fact. The Spring and Autumn Annals, a terse chronicle later associated with Confucius, often mentions the Zhou king in passing, a reminder that he still existed, but rarely the focus of events. The real drama was always elsewhere, in Qi, in Jin, in Chu, in Qin. The Zhou court had become like the sun at twilight, visible, but fading, outshone by brighter lights on the horizon. For the people of Luoyang, daily life still revolved around the presence of the court. Rituals were performed, festivals observed, sacrifices offered. The king's palace still loomed, though shabbier than its predecessors. But beyond Luoyang, Zhou authority was nearly invisible. Farmers in Chu or Zhao or Wei no longer thought of themselves as Zhou subjects, they thought of themselves as subjects of their immediate rulers. The Zhou name had become a thin thread connecting a fractured world. And yet, the dynasty endured. That's what makes this period so fascinating. Unlike the Shang, who were overthrown outright, the Zhou lingered for centuries as figureheads. Why? Because none of the warring states dared abolish them outright, at least, not yet. To destroy the Zhou throne entirely would have meant declaring oneself the new son of heaven, a bold claim that invited universal resistance. It was easier to let the Zhou kings survive as harmless relics, while real power flowed elsewhere. There's a strange dignity in this survival. Even stripped of armies and authority, the Zhou throne still carried symbolic weight. Philosophers like Confucius continued to revere the early Zhou as models of virtue. Ritual handbooks cited Zhou ceremonies as standards. When lords debated legitimacy, they still spoke in the language of the mandate of heaven, a concept the Zhou had introduced. In other words, the Zhou were gone as rulers but alive as an idea. But life as a shadow state was humiliating. By the late Eastern Zhou, kings sometimes depended on subsidies from stronger states just to maintain their court. Imagine the son of heaven reduced to asking for grain shipments from Qi or Qin, the symbol of unity begging from the very lords who had shattered it. It was survival by the grace of others. Worse still, the Zhou kings sometimes found themselves caught in the crossfire of rivalries. Luoyang, once chosen for safety, became a pawn in wars between stronger neighbors. Armies marched through, alliances shifted, and the court could do little but watch. The once mighty throne of the Zhou had become a pawn on the chessboard of warring states' politics. For ordinary people, the Zhou name may have been little more than background noise by this time. Farmers cared about the tax collector who came from their local lord, not the son of heaven in distant Luoyang. Soldiers fought under the banners of Qin or Chu, not under the fading emblem of Zhou. The dynasty that had once woven kinship, ritual, and cosmic order into daily life now lived only in ceremonial echoes. And yet, this shadow existence mattered. Because when Qin finally unified China, it would do so not as a rebel inventing something new, but as a successor to the Zhou mantle. Qin would claim to inherit the mandate of heaven, a concept Zhou kings had kept alive even in weakness. Without the Zhou shadow state, the very language of unity might have disappeared. Their survival, however hollow, preserved the idea that China was one realm under heaven, waiting for a true ruler to fill the empty throne. So picture the Zhou in their twilight. Kings presiding over rituals no one took seriously, ministers maintaining ceremonies for their own sake, Luoyang bustling with tradition, but devoid of power. A dynasty that had once conquered the Shang and reshaped the cosmos now survived as a symbol, fragile but enduring. Not quite dead, not truly alive, a dynasty in shadow. For centuries, the Zhou had survived as shadows, clinging to ritual and memory even as their feudal lords grew into kings in their own right. They had been humiliated, sidelined, reduced to pawns in the struggles of stronger states. And yet, somehow, they endured. There was always a Zhou king in Luoyang, always a son of heaven presiding over sacrifices, always a faint thread connecting the present to the golden past. But shadows cannot last forever. Eventually, even echoes fade. In 256 BCE, after more than 800 years, the Zhou dynasty finally ended with the death of its last king. The story of the last Zhou kings is not one of decisive battles or legendary rulers. It is one of weakness, irrelevance, and inevitability. By the 3rd century BCE, the Eastern Zhou kings had long ceased to matter politically. The great warring states, Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, Qi, were the true powers. The Zhou throne was a relic, tolerated because it was harmless and occasionally useful as a source of legitimacy. But as Qin grew stronger, even that use vanished. The final Zhou monarch is usually recorded as King Nan of Zhou, r. 314 to 256 BC. His reign lasted nearly 60 years, but it was a reign in name only. By his time, the Zhou kingdom had shrunk to little more than Luoyang and its immediate surroundings, a postage stamp of land compared to the vast domains of Qin or Chu. The king commanded no great armies, collected little tribute, and could not intervene in the wars that raged around him. His court performed rituals, but those rituals were hollow gestures in a world dominated by steel and strategy. Imagine the scene. While Qin's armies marched with iron discipline under legalist reforms, while Chu fielded massive forces in the south, while Zhao and Han maneuvered in desperate alliances, the Zhou king presided over ceremonies in Luoyang with dwindling attendance. The mandate of heaven, once a blazing claim, had become a whisper no one cared to hear. Farmers in distant lands may not have even known the Zhou king's name. He was irrelevant to their lives. Yet King Nan's very irrelevance gave him longevity. Because he posed no threat, the major states let him linger. He was like an old man left in the corner of a house, respected for age but ignored in affairs. His court probably clung to memories of greatness, preserving ancestral rites and records, as if the act of continuity itself was all that mattered. But time is merciless. As Qin grew stronger, swallowing state after state, even symbolic relics had to go. In 256 BCE, Qin made its move. Its armies marched east, annexing what little remained of Zhou territory. Luoyang fell and King Nan was taken prisoner. Some sources say he died that same year, others that he lingered briefly in captivity. Either way, the line of Zhou kings was extinguished. After more than 5 centuries in the east and 8 centuries in total, the dynasty that had once claimed heaven's mandate was no more. What makes this end so striking is how quiet it was compared to the beginning. The Zhou had risen in thunder, defeating the Shang at Mai, proclaiming the mandate of heaven, reshaping the political order of the Chinese world. They had fallen in fire once already, when Haojing was sacked in 771 BC. But this final end was not fiery. It was anticlimactic. No great coalition rose to defend them, no rival state rushed to their aid. Qin annexed the Zhou lands almost casually, as one more step in its march to empire. And yet, anticlimactic does not mean insignificant. The death of the last Zhou king was a symbolic watershed. It marked the end of the old feudal order entirely. The mandate of heaven, the rituals, the kinship web, all the tools that had once made the Zhou strong were now relics. The world had changed. Power was measured not by ritual prestige, but by centralized bureaucracy, standing armies, and ruthless efficiency. The Zhou, for all their endurance, could not belong to this new world. For later generations, King Nan became a symbol of tragic decline. Confucian writers mourned him as the last custodian of a once glorious tradition. His weakness contrasted with the virtue of the early kings. To them, his fate was proof of what happens when ritual is neglected and morality abandoned, a cautionary tale. Legalists, on the other hand, saw him as irrelevant, a fossil swept aside by the tide of history. Both perspectives reveal the same truth. By the time of his death, the Zhou dynasty was already a ghost. It's worth pausing on the emotional dimension. Imagine being a courtier in Luoyang, watching Qin armies approach, knowing your dynasty's long story was about to end. Your ancestors had served under kings who claimed heaven's mandate, who ruled lands stretching across the central plains. Now, you served a king who ruled little more than memory. What did loyalty mean in such a moment? What did ritual mean when the enemy stood at the gates? Perhaps some clung to dignity, performing rites to the very end. Perhaps others abandoned the king, seeking safety in Qin's embrace. Either way, the curtain was falling. When King Nan died, the Zhou name died with him. But the Zhou legacy did not. Their mandate of heaven became a permanent part of Chinese political thought. Their rituals, codified and revered, became models for Confucian order. Their idea of a single realm all under heaven gave Qin the ideological framework to declare itself the rightful unifier. Even in death, the Zhou shaped the empire to come. So the last Zhou king was not remembered for victories, reforms, or wisdom. He was remembered for being the end. The quiet extinguishing of a dynasty that had once burned so brightly. A shadow fading into nothing, but leaving behind the outline of an idea that would never fully vanish. When King Nan of Zhou died in 256 BCE, it wasn't just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an era. For more than 8 centuries, the Zhou had ruled, stumbled, revived, and lingered. They had gone from conquering heroes to ceremonial relics. But their very survival had kept alive the idea of a unified realm under heaven. With their extinguishing, that idea was up for grabs. And it was Qin that seized it. The rise of Qin had not been sudden. For generations, the state had been hardening itself under legalist reforms, cultivating discipline, militarizing society, and centralizing power. Its rulers had watched as rival states exhausted themselves in endless wars. Qin waited, sharpened, and struck. By the time King Nan breathed his last in Luoyang, Qin's armies were already the strongest in China, and its bureaucracy the most efficient. The annexation of Zhou territory was almost incidental, not a climactic battle, but a formality. Qin marched in, took Luoyang, and folded the remnants of Zhou land into its expanding domain. The old dynasty was erased without ceremony. What made Qin different from other states was its willingness to shed tradition. Where Chu and Qi still clung to aristocratic rituals, Qin embraced legalism's stark clarity, reward and punishment, law and order. Shang Yang's reforms had long ago stripped the nobility of privilege, empowering farmers and soldiers instead. In Qin, glory came from service, not lineage. This relentless pragmatism gave Qin a sharper edge than any rival. Qin also had geography on its side. Its western position, once a liability, gave it room to expand into sparsely populated lands, building strength without constant harassment from powerful neighbors. The Wei River Valley, fertile and defensible, provided a secure base. And Qin rulers invested heavily in infrastructure, roads that could move armies swiftly, canals that could irrigate fields and transport supplies. Where other states faltered under logistical strain, Qin thrived. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Qin was already moving against the weaker states. Han and Wei, squeezed between Qin and Zhao, were battered repeatedly. Shu, vast but loosely organized, found itself overextended. Qi, rich but complacent, hesitated to act. One by one, Qin tested its rivals, probing for weakness, breaking alliances with bribes or threats. Its diplomacy was as ruthless as its armies. The fall of the Zhou gave Qin a priceless gift: legitimacy. The Zhou throne had survived so long because even in weakness, it symbolized heaven's order. With King Nan gone, Qin could claim to inherit that mantle. It was not yet the unification of China that would come decades later under Qin Shi Huang. But in 256 BCE, Qin could plausibly argue that the old order was finished and the new belonged to them. The mandate of heaven, first claimed by the Zhou against the Shang, now seemed to have shifted again, this time westward to Qin. For the people of Luoyang, the takeover must have been surreal. One day, the Zhou king sat on the throne, however weakly. The next, Qin officials walked the palace halls, and Zhou banners were lowered. Farmers in the surrounding countryside now paid taxes not to the Son of Heaven, but to Qin administrators. Rituals that had once invoked Zhou ancestors were replaced by Qin proclamations. The change was abrupt, yet oddly anticlimactic, like waking to find that history had quietly moved on while you slept. For rival states, Qin's absorption of Zhou territory was a clear warning. The age of Zhou figureheads was over. There was no longer even a ceremonial center to rally around. The vacuum was total, and Qin was poised to fill it. Some lords may have felt unease at the symbolism. The last Zhou king dead, the capital fallen, but none could stop Qin's momentum. The balance of power had tipped decisively. Symbolism mattered deeply in this moment. Qin didn't just conquer land, it claimed to replace Zhou as the rightful bearer of heaven's mandate. The Zhou had taught China that heaven grants legitimacy to the virtuous and withdraws it from the corrupt. Qin, with its ruthless efficiency, now framed itself as the instrument of heaven's will. In this way, Qin didn't reject Zhou ideology, it co-opted it. The very concept that had justified Zhou rule against the Shang was now turned against the Zhou themselves. Archaeology reinforces this transition. In Luoyang and other sites, Zhou-style bronzes and ritual vessels give way to more practical Qin artifacts, weapons, standardized tools, legal inscriptions. The shift from ritual to regulation is stark. Where Zhou kings had inscribed bronzes with praises of loyalty and virtue, Qin left behind laws carved in stone, dictating punishments and rewards. It was a new world, less about cosmic harmony, more about bureaucratic control. And yet, Qin's dominance wasn't inevitable in the eyes of contemporaries. Other states still believed they could resist. Coalitions formed, treaties were signed. Su Qin's vertical alliance sought to unite the remaining states against Qin's aggression. But Qin was patient, cunning, and relentless. It broke alliances one by one, striking where opponents were weakest. By the time most realized Qin's true strength, it was too late. The fall of Zhou in 256 BCE was thus less a dramatic climax than a symbolic shift, the clearing away of the last shadow of the old order, making room for the brutal clarity of the new. Qin didn't just inherit Zhou land, it inherited Zhou's ideological mantle. The Son of Heaven was gone, but the concept remained, waiting for Qin to claim it fully. For later historians, this moment was both tragic and inevitable. Tragic because the Zhou, once so radiant in their golden age, had dwindled into irrelevance. Inevitable because Qin's rise embodied the new logic of survival. Ritual and kinship had given way to law and discipline. The Zhou vessel had cracked and shattered, Qin had forged iron in its place. The last Zhou king was gone, the Zhou lands absorbed into Qin, and the dynasty itself consigned to the past. On paper, it looked final, a clean break, a fallen house swept away by a new and stronger order. Yet culture rarely dies so abruptly. Dynasties may collapse, but the habits, ideals, and traditions they nurture often outlive them. And the Zhou, for all their decline, had planted ideas so deeply that even their conquerors could not erase them. In truth, the Zhou dynasty never truly disappeared, it simply lived on in new forms, woven into the fabric of what came after. Start with the most enduring of Zhou legacies, the Mandate of Heaven. This idea, first articulated when the Zhou justified their conquest of the Shang, became the single most important framework for legitimacy in Chinese history. No matter how harsh or ruthless a new dynasty was, it could not simply say, "We rule because we're strong." It had to claim heaven's blessing, and it had to explain why its predecessor had lost it. This cyclical vision, rise with virtue, fall with corruption, became the heartbeat of dynastic history in China. Qin would claim the mandate. So would Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing. Each traced their right to rule back to the Zhou invention. The dynasty was dead, but its idea was immortal. Then there were the rituals. The Zhou had turned ritual into a social glue, binding kings and nobles, ancestors and descendants, heaven and earth. Even when their power waned, their ceremonies continued. Later Confucian thinkers, especially, saw Zhou ritual as the model for proper governance. The Book of Rites, Liji, compiled in later centuries, revered Zhou practices as the template for order. To perform a Zhou-style ritual was to align oneself with cosmic harmony. Long after the Zhou palaces had crumbled, rulers across China bowed, sacrificed, and feasted in ways that echoed Zhou forms. Zhou influence also lingered in language and literature. The Book of Songs, Shijing, a collection of Zhou-era poetry, became one of the foundational texts of Chinese culture. Students memorized its verses, scholars mined it for moral lessons, Confucians saw it as proof of the proper cultivation of emotion and ritual. The Zhou Book of Changes, a divination manual dating to Zhou times, evolved into one of the most influential works of philosophy, studied not just as a fortune-telling guide, but as a profound meditation on change and balance. These texts were not just relics, they were living tools, shaping thought for centuries. Philosophy, too, bore Zhou imprints. Confucius revered the Duke of Zhou as the ultimate model of virtuous governance. Mencius, another great Confucian, invoked the mandate of heaven as a principle of moral legitimacy. Even legalists, who dismissed virtue in favor of law, defined themselves in opposition to Zhou ideals. Taoists, with their skepticism of ritual, still framed their critiques in Zhou terms. In short, Zhou culture became the reference point, the standard against which later thinkers argued, whether they embraced it or rejected it. Architecture and urban planning carried Zhou fingerprints as well. The grid-like layouts of cities, the emphasis on central palaces flanked by ritual altars, the division of land into well-field systems, all reflected Zhou precedents, even as they evolved in later dynasties. Qin, despite its disdain for Zhou weakness, still drew on Zhou models when building its capital at Xianyang, and later the Han would inherit both. The Zhou had written the blueprint for what a Chinese capital should look like, and later rulers followed it, consciously or not. Even socially, Zhou patterns lingered. The family-based hierarchy that Zhou had emphasized, father over son, elder over younger, husband over wife, became the bedrock of Confucian morality and, by extension, Chinese society. The Zhou had fused kinship with politics, embedding hierarchy in both. That logic persisted, shaping family life, education, and governance for millennia. When a Han official lectured about filial piety or a Ming scholar praised ancestral rites, they were channeling Zhou ideals. It's ironic, Qin, the very state that extinguished Zhou kingship, could not escape Zhou culture. Qin rulers enforced legalist laws, but they still claimed the mandate of heaven. They abolished feudal aristocracy, but they justified their rule in terms inherited from Zhou ideology. And when Qin fell, toppled by rebellion after only 15 years of empire, the Han dynasty eagerly wrapped itself in Zhou cultural robes. Han rulers claimed to restore Zhou ideals, blending them with Qin efficiency. The result was a synthesis, legalist machinery running on Confucian fuel, that would define imperial China. For ordinary people, Zhou culture lingered in subtler ways. In songs sung at festivals, in family rituals honoring ancestors, in proverbs that traced back to Zhou texts, in the layout of villages tied to Zhou agricultural systems. People who had never seen a Zhou king still lived in a world the Zhou had shaped. Culture outlives politics because it seeps into the everyday, becoming invisible until you look closely. Later generations remembered the Zhou with a mix of reverence and sadness. Reverence, because their golden age was seen as a model of harmony, virtue, and proper order. Sadness, because their decline was a cautionary tale, proof of what happens when rulers lose virtue and forget their mandate. Confucians in particular turned Zhou history into a moral parable, the early Zhou as inspiration, the late Zhou as warning. In this way, the Zhou dynasty became less a political memory and more a moral compass. Even today, Zhou culture lingers. The phrase mandate of heaven is still invoked in Chinese historical consciousness. The Analects still praise the Duke of Zhou. The Book of Changes still fascinates philosophers and diviners alike. And in every dynastic cycle told in Chinese history, the Zhou story echoes: virtue brings rise, corruption brings fall, heaven shifts its mandate. That rhythm, first sung by Zhou, became the drumbeat of centuries. So yes, the Zhou as a dynasty ended with King Nan, swallowed by Qin's relentless expansion. But the Zhou as a culture never ended. They became the soil from which later dynasties grew, the ghosts that haunted every throne room, the standard against which rulers measured themselves. To borrow an image, if Qin built the empire with iron and law, it was Zhou who gave that empire its language of legitimacy, its rituals of authority, its moral frame. The dynasty was dead, the idea lived on. The Zhou dynasty is one of those stories that feels almost too vast for a single thread. From the thunderous victory at Mai against the Shang in 1046 BC to the quiet extinction of King Nan in 256 BC, it spanned over 800 years, the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history. And yet, when we step back, what lingers isn't just the dates or the names of kings. It's the rhythm of rise, glory, decline, and survival. It's the way the Zhou managed to both vanish and endure, collapsing as rulers while persisting as culture. Their story begins, as so many do, with revolution. The Zhou were outsiders once, semi-peripheral to the Shang heartland. Their leaders King Wen, King Wu, the Duke of Zhou channeled discontent and wrapped their cause in a new idea, the mandate of heaven. It was brilliant, elegant, and devastating. Heaven, they said, grants legitimacy not forever but conditionally. A dynasty holds power only so long as it rules with virtue. Lose virtue, lose the mandate. This concept justified the Zhou conquest of the Shang. But it also planted a time bomb beneath their own throne. For if heaven's mandate could pass once, it could pass again. The early Zhou rulers shone with energy. They built a feudal order based on kinship, balancing loyalty and autonomy. They spread their culture through rituals, bronzes, and poetry. They presided over what later thinkers would remember as a golden age, not perfect, but harmonious enough to inspire nostalgia for millennia. The Western Zhou kings seemed to embody the balance between heaven and earth. But golden ages rarely last. Distance frayed loyalty. Aristocrats grew powerful. Enemies beyond the borders tested defenses. By 771 BCE, the Western Zhou were overrun, their capital Haojing sacked, their authority broken. Yet they didn't die. They limped east to Luoyang, reinventing themselves as figureheads. The Eastern Zhou lasted another 5 centuries, a dynasty without real power, surviving on ritual and memory. In that weakness, paradoxically, the Zhou gave birth to greatness. The spring and autumn world saw lords eclipse kings, alliances form and shatter, and a new diplomacy emerge. Out of that uncertainty came thinkers like Confucius, who looked back to the early Zhou as a model of virtue. Then the warring states exploded: massive armies, iron weapons, centralized bureaucracies, ruthless strategies. Zhou kings became irrelevant, but their ideas became essential. The mandate of heaven, Zhou rituals, and Zhou literature became the moral and intellectual backbone of the age. By the time Qin annexed Zhou lands in 256 BCE, the dynasty was already a ghost. Its kings presided over ceremonies no one heeded, its lands reduced to a sliver. And yet, when Qin claimed heaven's mandate, it did so in Zhou's language. When Han later fused Confucian virtue with legalist machinery, it looked to Zhou for the blueprint. In this sense, Zhou did not fall at all. It dissolved into the bloodstream of Chinese civilization. The Zhou story is both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because no dynasty before or after so thoroughly defined the cultural DNA of China. Their rituals, their philosophies, their vision of legitimacy shaped 2 millennia of empire. Tragedy, because their own system, the feudal web of kinship and ritual, contained the seeds of their downfall. They created a brilliant order, but one too fragile to withstand ambition and geography. They conquered with the mandate of heaven, but in the end, that same mandate explained why they themselves had to fall. There's something profoundly human in this rhythm. The Zhou kings believed they were aligning heaven and earth, but they were also just rulers wrestling with the same dilemmas every dynasty faces: how to keep power centralized, how to balance ritual with reality, how to control ambitious lords. Their answers worked until they didn't. And when they failed, the system collapsed not all at once, but in slow motion: decline, survival, lingering shadow, final extinguishing. And yet, perhaps that slow fade was the Zhou's greatest gift. By surviving so long as figureheads, they kept alive the idea of a unified order under heaven. They ensured that when Qin finally conquered all, it wasn't inventing something new, but inheriting a concept Zhou had sustained. Their political death created cultural immortality. So when we reflect on the Zhou, we're not just telling the story of one dynasty. We're telling the story of how political power and cultural influence diverge. A king can lose his land, his armies, his throne, and yet his ideas can outlive him. The Zhou lost everything tangible, but their vision became the bedrock of what came after. That is both ironic and fitting: a dynasty that fell, and in falling, ensured its eternal presence.